Hello, and welcome to the second day of our annual Building Resilience Through Public-Private Partnerships Conference. For those of you just joining today, I'm Mark DeCourcy, the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation, and I lead the Chamber's Corporate Citizenship Center. Yesterday, we covered what the new normal looks like, reflecting on the challenges of last year, lessons learned, and how to ensure a more inclusive recovery as we emerge from the pandemic. Today, we'll talk about how to move forward. What does the next decade and beyond look like? And how do we respond to the crisis at hand while looking ahead to future emergencies? If you missed any of the sessions yesterday or want to watch something again, I encourage you to visit our YouTube channel. We'll be posting recordings for our programming. Now, to kick off today's program, I'm pleased to introduce Caitlin Durkovich, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director of Resilience and Response for the White House National Security Council. Caitlin, thanks for being here with us today.
Good afternoon, Mark. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the opportunity to participate in this year's Building Resilience Conference. This is not my first Building Resilience Conference. For those of you who may not be aware, I had the great pleasure of serving as the Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at the Department of Homeland Security under the Obama administration. And in fact, DHS was the host of one of these conferences during my tenure. And I was trying to remember, Mark, if it was the conference where I think there was a tornado warning in the middle of the event, and we contemplated hiding underneath the tables that were in the room. But I need to go back down memory lane a little bit for that one. So it's great to be here. I have had an opportunity to participate in a number of these conferences, and I can't tell you how important they are. So thank you for continuing to convene. Clearly, a lot has happened since I left office in 2017, and there are plenty of challenges, both old and new, that we face and need to address. And frankly, that's why I'm so honored and privileged to be back in government, serving on the tremendous team here at the White House. And this is a team under President Biden's leadership and direction that is laser focused on addressing some of the most significant challenges we face as a nation, including tackling the growing threats from foreign adversaries, climate change, protecting and strengthening our critical infrastructure in vital supply chains, and bolstering relationships with our allies around the world to restore trust in the democratic institutions. As Senior Director for Resilience and Response here at the National Security Council, I can say that while progress in each of these areas depends on many factors, strengthening our resilience as a nation is really what underpins all of them. Let me start by saying what we all know, that there is no common single definition of resilience after all of these years. But I'm going to start by telling you how I define resilience and how we need to think about what it means for our nation. So when I talk about resilience, I use the definition it's about anticipation, identification, responding to, recovering from, and bouncing forward. That's how I think about resilience. And I think the key terms there are the anticipating and the bouncing forward. And this is where, I will look back at how the Commission on 9/11 kind of framed the failure of imagination. And 9/11 was not just a failure of imagination, but really a failure to routinize how we use imagination to think about what may be in front of us. And I think as we move forward, building in that healthy paranoia and really thinking about what are the challenges that face us. We have known for a long time that supply chains could be a problem, that climate change could be a problem. We have to do a better job early on embracing and anticipating and identifying those threats. And then certainly as we go through them, how do we build on the lessons learned and not just bounce back, but bounce forward and become more, stronger and more resilient because of it. Let me take that definition of resilience and now move into supply chain, the topic of today's session. First, let me begin by saying this topic has perhaps never been more relevant in our modern era, arguably not since the energy crisis of 1970s or even World War II have Americans so severely been impacted by disruptions to our supply chains. Indeed, the COVID pandemic made all Americans acutely aware of our dependence not only on foreign manufacturing, but also on our global transportation system to deliver goods and commodities that working families needed to thrive and prosper. From toilet paper, if we all can remember back that far, to medical supplies and computer chips, every American has experienced supply chain impacts firsthand over the past year. Then earlier this year, millions of Americans on the East Coast experienced the firsthand impact of a criminal ransomware attack on one of our nation's most important pipelines, an attack that originated beyond our shores, targeted an information technology system, and had far-reaching physical and economic impacts on our nation. So as this group goes, excuse me for a minute. As this group knows, gone are the days where we can take comfort in our geographic position alone. We are interconnected and interdependent with the rest of the world, which creates both opportunities and threats, and we need to work together in partnership to address them. I would characterize the events of the past year as a clarion call for action in our and President Biden has directed us to act. So let me tell you a couple of things that we are doing right here in the White House now. As many of you are aware, the president signed an executive order 14017, in February, directing a whole of government approach to assessing the vulnerabilities to our critical supply chains and with a call to action to strengthen their resilience. Stemming from that effort, the administration has taken steps to address supply chain vulnerabilities, from expanding the manufacture of vaccines and other essential medical supplies to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, to investments in rare earth mining and processing to improve our nation's cybersecurity. Building on these efforts, the administration released in June findings from a comprehensive 100-day supply chain assessment of 4 critical products: semiconductors, large capacity batteries, critical minerals and materials, and pharmaceuticals. These reports document a wide range of risk and vulnerabilities to our supply chains for critical products. Pursuant to the executive order, relevant departments and agencies across the government are now developing comprehensive strategies to address these risks and more broadly to revitalize our industrial base. In line with the overarching theme of the conference, building resilience through public-private partnerships, the president will be convening a global forum on supply chain resilience later this year. Our nation's resilience is a shared responsibility, and by working together, our nation will continue to prosper amid a complex and dynamic risk landscape. Together with you, our partners, we will take a whole-of-nation approach from supply chain resilience to preparedness and response to address the most pressing challenges our nation faces today. And with that, I'd like to now turn to moderating the next panel, The Next Decade and Beyond. We have a great lineup of speakers from across a diverse sector of industries and governments. I've asked each of them today to discuss how they're building resilience within their respective organizations, missions, and functions. So with that, and I do want to just acknowledge here that we are a little bit constrained by time, and I've asked each of our panel participants to try and keep their opening remarks to 3 to 4 minutes. And if we have time, we can engage in further question and answer. But I'm going to turn to Jason Jackson, who is the Vice President of Customer Experience at Infinite Blue. Jason is a highly respected executive thought leader in security, safety, and crisis management and Infinite Blue helps organizations develop resilience planning and strategies. And so, Jason, my question to you is both what is your definition of resilience, but what makes the difference between a resilient organization and a less resilient organization?
Great. Thank you, Caitlin and Mark and the Chamber for having me here today. Honestly, I go back to your definition of resilience because I think that the words that you use, bounce forward, are absolutely fantastic. I mean, simply put, resilience is simply the capability of an organization or system to be able to adapt, withstand, respond, recover from a difficulty or complexity, crisis, or disruption. But that bounce forward aspect is absolutely critical in today's day and age. The word in there that I love to use is adapt, because I think that that's, especially coming off of COVID and dealing with this for the last year plus, our ability to adapt as an organization, as communities, as a nation, as a global partner has become more important than ever before. The 360 degrees around that, of course, planning and preparedness and mitigation, identification, response, recovery, all go into that. But this is not yesterday's planning activity. Resilience is active, and it's an active engagement, and it requires organizations to be active in planning for their own resilience. And the days of having a plan on a shelf and it gathering dust are, well, one, were never acceptable, but today, most definitely, as we look forward at the next decade, are most definitely not acceptable. But as I look at organizations and who's resilient and who's not resilient, there's just a few things that I look at. And I'll go back to what I just said. Number one is, are they active in their own resilience? And that means, are they applying thought leadership? Have they applied this to the culture of their company? Have they invested in people and process and technology to help understand, organize, and also simplify how their company or their organization or their agency does resilience? I think the second thing in there, a little more common, is really having that comprehensive understanding of their organization, their critical functions, and what it's actually required to run that. And you hit on supply chain earlier, because this means understanding the upstream and the downstream of their interconnectedness and how they work, their dependencies, their partnerships, and everything that makes them run as a whole in the ecosystem. The others, I think the last couple things for me really come down to the here and the now and how they work through their daily activity. And one is just being aware of their current environment, and how and when and what impacts them and what it means to that organization and their ability to do that. But the second, right behind that, is really about their ability to look into the future and look around corners and over the horizon at what's coming next. And so as we think about things like infrastructure and cyber and more disasters in the future or geopolitical issues, their ability to look forward to make sure that they are starting to set their foundations in the stage now to prepare their organizations for that becomes even more important, especially as we look at not just those individual issues, but how they all how they stack and the combination of those things all together as potential risks. Like I said, I think resilience itself does not sit still, and neither should organizations. And as a quick shameless plug for the conference in general, the notion of public-private partnerships and how that plays into community resilience, and how organizations need to think about themselves as part of their communities to make them stronger, and also to make our nation stronger, is equally important.
Thank you very much, Jason. And I like the concept of active, and I also appreciate the needing to prepare for the future and look over the horizon. We can't predict the future, but we can certainly imagine what some of the possible outcomes are and ensure that we're best positioned to do that. So thank you very much for your comments. I'd now like to move to Scott Gibson, who is the head of strategy and planning for global security at Uber. In this role, Scott oversees the development and execution of the global security strategic plan and manages the team's operating rhythm. And as we talked a little bit about yesterday, Scott, Uber really is this the intersection of human capital and technology. And so my question to you is that based on the fact that you really are built on this interface of human capital and technology, how do you think about resilience, and what are some of the kind of key principles that you embrace as you try to build a resilient organization?
Hi, Caitlin. Yeah, that's a great question. It's one we think about a lot at Uber, and how it presents both opportunities, but also when you look at that intersection of IT and physical, the barriers it can create too, and then how we need to think about overcoming those. In many ways, I personally see the core of the Uber platform as a means of building resilience in communities. At very basic levels, it can provide transportation to those who may not otherwise have access to it, or delivery services, or alternative means of income if you're considering economic resilience. And in a disaster situation, those capabilities across mobility, delivery, freight logistics, especially of late, enable us to move people to safety or get them essential supplies and services before a disaster, and also set them up more quickly for recovery. In the past few years, that's come to fruition in the form of rides to shelters during wildfires, moving PPE on our platform during COVID, and more recently partnering with the White House on getting people to vaccination sites. So we've been playing this role more and more. But to your question, to your point, there are some inherent barriers that come with that. And it's not just thinking about the resilience of our company, but the platform itself. And typically, users are going to need access to a smartphone or Wi-Fi, or they need their own transportation to join the app as a driver, or we may be limited by the operability of our own interdependencies, for example, telecommunications. So we've spent a lot of time thinking about how do we overcome these barriers through alternative means of accessing Uber, whether that's how you request a ride or get on the platform as a driver, or even how we can help ensure the individual preparedness of our drivers so that they are able to join the platform and support disaster response and recovery safely. It's kind of a critical component of the Uber kind of ecosystem. If you want to put it in the terms of supply chain, people are a critical component of that. And if we're going to be active and resilient in how we support our communities, ensuring the people on our platform are resilient too is equally important. I'll quickly, on that note, also give a shout out to Rob Glenn and his team at FEMA, because we've spoken a lot about how to address some of these challenges and leverage each other's expertise and skills. But overall, I really think it's a glimpse into this next decade of how we're looking at risk and interdependencies. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Bob has to say in a few minutes, but more and more with new technologies and platforms, I feel like we're moving away from industries and services that fit neatly into the critical infrastructure boxes of old that we've focused on for the past couple decades when we think about assessing risk and building resilience. We have large numbers of small components that contribute to the resilience of communities. And it's going to take a heavy amount of coordination to understand what those components are, or how they contribute, how they're interconnected and interdependent with one another. And beyond that, what it's likely going to create is a challenge in and of itself, just to track everything that's out there that may or may not now be providing some sort of critical service to a community. So I think this next decade is going to require some reassessment of the landscape in and of itself, of what these platforms and services are that are becoming more critical, and understand the complexities they're creating and how they're dependent on one another. So ultimately, I think that's going to present a lot of opportunity in how we think about the diversification of resilience. But it comes with some inherent challenges, like ensuring we're not creating new single points of failure in our communities, right? So I think we have a pretty interesting future ahead of us in many ways for this next decade. But I think as much as I agree with the definition of resilience that we've discussed, I think how that's now applied in communities is going to take potentially a new way of thinking to make sure we're addressing all the different players in the space now.
Scott, thank you very much for that. And I want to thank everything that you've done to help make sure that communities are resilient. Today, actually here in the White House, we just kicked off an equitable recovery policy process to really think about the challenges that those that are less fortunate and live in disadvantaged communities have when it comes to responding to disasters and the things that we take for granted, right? And the ability to advocate for ourselves and having access to mobile phones and credit cards and a savings account. It makes it easier for us to bounce back, but that's not necessarily the case. And so thank you for all that you do. And I think as we, think about resilience, we need to remember that we've, got critical both workforce, but other communities that we have to account for and keep in mind that are key to our communities and the resilience of them. So I appreciate that. I'm glad you got to dress up a little bit in your button down shirt. You look very nice. And I did throw a little bit of an audible. So I thank you for being resilient. I was supposed to go to Zach next, but I actually think your remarks set up Zach rather well. Zach is the CEO at the St. Bernard Project, or SBP, a national organization that is focused on disaster resilience and recovery. He founded it in 2006 following Hurricane Katrina. I think that we are near the 15-year anniversary, actually, of Hurricane Katrina. So, Zach, what I'd like to ask you about is, how do you think about resilient? And in your experience, what makes a community more resilient in the face of a disaster? What are the, things that they do, the principles that they embrace that may make them more likely not just to bounce back, but bounce forward in the face of a disaster?
Yeah, Caitlin, thank you very much. And thank you for sharing this administration's focus on making sure that all policies have a lens of racial equity. And I think if you think of industries that have been sort of rife with traditional lack of equity, you got to think of housing industry. And unfortunately, you can look at the data around disaster recovery. I know we have some great friends at FEMA here, and I applaud the recent FEMA Advisory Committee report that highlights the fact that after disaster, when federal funds are invested, generally white communities and white folks increase their net worth, while folks of color, and this is when the federal funds are invested, folks of color decrease net worth. So there's a few things that I suppose we suggest. First of all, in terms of defining resilience, people have to have the facts and have a pathway towards understanding and mitigating risk. They have to know how to navigate recovery. And this is not a shameless plug. This is an investment in all of you. My colleague will put on the chat a link to an Equip app that we made with our partner AT&T that's really designed for people and employees of companies. If you think of business continuity, companies and sophisticated companies now have extremely fantastic technical business continuity plans, but where home is now the office, there's incredible vulnerability around the workforce. And this Equip app, we think, is one that will allow your team members to, again, understand and mitigate risk. So people have to know how to do that. They need to know how to navigate recovery. And fundamentally, it has to work for all. You asked the question, Caitlin, what can local communities do? And I think there's a few things. There's what local communities can do, and then there's the federal framework. I'll start with the federal framework. First of all, it has to be accessible for everybody. We know it's not working. There's a couple fixes here. One is a one app. Currently, homeowners have to apply separately 3 times for FEMA, for SBA, and the eventual HUD season.
Just talking about this very thing this morning. Yes.
Oh, I guess I outed myself that I wasn't there. No, double outed myself. Well, SPP has a white paper, and we're working on legislation around a one app that would allow folks very simply like FAFSA to apply once. And when you think of American citizens who apply, these are people really who are loath to ask for help. It's anathema to who they are. And if they get the least bit of resilience or water on their deed, they're not going to be able to follow through. It's almost built for attrition. Second of all, FEMA damage assessments. The first, if you look at kind of the sequencing of the dollars that come in, FEMA dollars come in the first 6 months. And then the HUD dollars at best hit the ground 18 months to 36 months later. If you look at last year's storms, there still hasn't been a congressional appropriation for HUD CDBG dollars. So FEMA's the first money. And right now FEMA does their best to send people to houses, or created a new phone way of working with people to understand the damage. But it's not working for everybody. It's never worked. It's expensive. The right answer is for FEMA, we believe, to use the same technology that insurance companies are using. We're hoping to pilot that in Louisiana. There's digital imagery, there's AI or machine learning, and it can quicker, faster, and as we all know, predictably give people what they need. Then if you look at indeed what communities can do, they have to know how to play by the rules of the game. And if we're looking at communities that are able to either get ahead or recover quickly, they're the ones that have the people, resources, the technical expertise to navigate these programs. I can't applaud this administration enough for the BRIC program and the money and infrastructure that's coming, but there's going to be winners and losers if the local communities can't access these funds. SPP has a Recovery Fellows program where we place public administrators into at-risk rural and underserved communities, and with the goal of accessing those dollars. And we train recovery leaders as well to access the dollars and spend them in a way that elevates outcomes to the same level of compliance. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks so much for the way you invest your career and the values you have.
Thank you very much, Zach. And we will be following up with you on what you've learned and on the One app. And so just look out for an email from me. I'm excited to pull you into what we're doing on equitable recovery. So thank you.
Terrific. Thank you.
All right. So just for Christopher and Bob, the chamber has been kind enough to let us go a little bit over time. But if you, can try and keep your responses for 3 to 4 minutes, and then we'll check back and see if we have time for any other questions. Christopher, let me go to you. You are the Enterprise Risk and Sustainability Director at Lockheed Martin. Your unit specializes in logistic information systems, automated test equipment, and aircraft ground support equipment. I want to talk a little bit about supply chain resilience with you. And you are the defense industrial base. Lockheed Martin is heavily dependent on both the kind of critical minerals and materials that we've been talking about, as well as, key parts from overseas, some countries that, we consider to be our greatest strategic threats. How do you think about supply chain resilience, and how have you changed your thinking, post-COVID and some of the other developments that have happened related to supply chain risk?
Yeah, thanks for the question. The defense industrial base has to be resilient to both natural and adversarial risks. So when COVID-19 pandemic started in 2020, we were ready to support our suppliers, especially small and vulnerable businesses, with accelerated payments to maintain their cash flow. The U.S. Department of Defense showed prescient leadership by increasing progress payments on government contracts, and we ensured that benefit flowed to our suppliers. In many cases, suppliers' commercial business dries up in those critical times. So aerospace and defense business is critical to maintaining them. Keeping current suppliers operating through difficult times is really one way to maintain resilience. Another specific supply chain resilience action is to detect and prevent counterfeit parts, no matter where they originate. We included a counterfeit parts related goal in a recent sustainability management plan. Having trusted assurance of part provenance can be a corporate sustainability issue in our industry. For instance, we've worked with the Air Force on microsurety for trusted microelectronics. I recommend companies explore if this is a material sustainability issue for them as well. Now, relating to your specific question on the critical minerals and materials, it's important that the entire supply chain is secure, including processing, refining, transportation, not just extraction. As a supplementary source to meet the demand to power the green economy, Seabed minerals can actually offer a greater collection and processing location alternative for geographical resiliency. Finally, I also have to mention multi-tier supply chain cybersecurity, because it's not just the physical supply chain that must be resilient. Critical software supply chain components can be just as susceptible to disruption. So strong information security among all participants increases supply chain resilience and will be more important over the next decade.
Christopher, thank you very much for that. I'm now going to turn to our final panelist, Bob Pulaski, a longtime friend and colleague who leads the Department of Homeland Security National Risk Management Center, which facilitates cross-sector risk management approaches to cyber and physical threats to critical infrastructure. Bob, always nice to be on a panel with you. Can you talk a little bit about how the NRMC thinks about analyzes supply chain risk and how you prioritize where we need to focus our efforts?
Sure, Caitlin, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be with this guest panel and the chamber again. I'll take it up even a level broader and talk a little more than just supply chain resilience. I talk risk. We've set our risk basis around 5 strategic risk areas. Supply chain is one of those. Another is cybersecurity, particularly with a focus on industrial control systems. As you saw, as you know, Caitlin, the president announced a new industrial control systems critical infrastructure policy this morning, which we were excited to see and look forward to working on. But in addition to that, the pandemic, COVID, climate change and climate change associated impacts, and then mis, dis, and malinformation. And so that's the risk basis by which we are trying to be resilient against. We want to be resilient against everything, as you know, but let's start with a range of risks to think about that. And then to your question, how do we think analytically of what it means to be resilient? It is around the idea that we have these things called national critical functions that our infrastructure produces. We've identified 55 national critical functions. They're available on our website. Things like generating electricity and maintaining supply chains and having the ability to transport goods and materials via cargo, via shipping, and maintaining the financial system, supply of water. Those are the critical functions that need to be resilient. I laid out some of the risk scenarios, and we want to understand technically what would make a critical function resilient, and actually understand how the function is produced, how the function contributes to economic security, national security, economic competitiveness, and community well-being. And we're doing the technical work to understand the function. And a lot of what we're trying to do functionally is to recognize that there are going to be vulnerabilities in all of these systems, the kind of hazards and scenarios we care about. There's going to be a way that something's going to go wrong, but the whole system doesn't have to collapse. It doesn't have to fail. It doesn't have to fail fast. Going back to the earlier conversation, it can absorb vulnerabilities. It can absorb adversaries or weather, taking down parts of the function because the function is resilient enough to survive. And so I think a lot of the technical work about resiliency is understanding that vulnerabilities don't have to lead to system-wide collapse, whether those are vulnerabilities in terms of technologies, software, or hardware. We do a lot of our work in system control systems around that, or whether those are vulnerabilities in terms of the availability of supplies, the availability of the workforce, the kind of challenges we had and we still have during the pandemic and related to the pandemic and those sorts of things. If the function can withstand the shock scenario, then we're stronger as a country. And when the function can't, that's when we should invest in resilience. And that's how I think about the technical work. I can't end a resilience answer without saying the technical work's only part of the answer here. A lot of it is through conferences like this, through public-private partnerships, through interagency collaboration, through working with the non-governmental organizations. Build trust, work through these things on blue sky days, have the relationships so that on black sky days, we're not going to get the technical parts exactly right. We're not going to understand the engineering. We don't know exactly how the scenario is going to play out. we'll do the technical work, and then we will react to the technical work through the structures of the public-private partnerships that we put in place to solve problems at the speed of the manifesting for communities. And I think all of us contribute to that from where we sit. And what I love about this conference is that it brings together folks and recognizes that there's no one lead for being resilient. It is a whole of community effort, to use a favorite cliche at this point, but one that I believe firmly in.
Thank you, Bob. I would like to pull the string on shock scenarios because it's something that I think Jason touched on too, right? Just not how we think about today's threats, but those future threats. I don't know though, I want to turn to my chamber colleagues if we have time, additional time, or if it's time to wrap up. And if I don't hear anything, I'm going to pull the string on this. So how do you think about the shock scenarios, right? So we're not just looking at if a function can absorb the shocks, as you said, from today's or yesterday's threats, right? That we're also planning for the future. So how do we get folks using some foresight, using some future, something I know a little bit about, to make sure we're prepared for tomorrow as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, that's where you stop studying the thing that can go wrong, and you start studying how things are evolving, because how things are evolving is what the adversaries aren't going to catch up with that. So how is digitalization evolving? Going back to the Uber question, how are we using technology differently? What new infrastructure is being developed? Where is there infrastructure underinvestment? What are geopolitical trends in terms of alliances? What is community well-being? Those sort of factors will help us understand whether we are ultimately going to see emerging risks, because the emerging risks come from other factors. So don't go chasing after trying to understand the emerging risk. Chase after understand how society is evolving, get out of that mindset, and then do some stress tests. If it's evolving this way, how is it going to change our operations? How would adversaries perhaps get to us? Really try to understand the things that are, how the things that are critical at any level of the organization are evolving based on those external foresight factors. That's how I approach it.
Jason, let me flip it to you, right? How do you get organizations to look up and over the horizon as opposed to, what's immediately at hand?
I think it goes back to the foundation of understanding their company and where they're going to begin with, and the back to the upstream and downstream of all of their interconnectedness and where they plan to be interconnected, which is why this forward-looking conversation becomes so important. But I agree with Bob. I think that it's not always in looking at the risk factors, because the reality is if we try to look 10 years down the road, we don't know all the things that are going to happen in that time. And so focusing back towards the things that we can control, and what's happening within our own environments, what's happening with our partnerships in our communities, and how our partners are evolving and getting out of assumptions. And this is why this conference is so important in sharing ideas back and forth, but getting out of making sure that or listening to assumptions as opposed to facts of how our friends and partners plan.
All right. With that, I believe we have run out of time. I do just want to thank you. Bob used the term august, this very august panel. I so enjoy these conferences. They are always a learning opportunity for me. I think it underscores the enormity of the complexity that we're dealing with, and how big the security and resilience challenge is, and how and why it is so important that this is a public-private partnership, a whole of community effort. This is not something the federal government can solve alone, or the private sector, or the nonprofit sector. We have to do it together, and we do it together by coming together to talk through the hard issues and to surface innovative ideas and approaches and lessons learned. And so I again want to thank the Chamber Foundation, FEMA, DHS, NORTHCOM, all of you. I look forward to being your partners in this effort over the next 4 years for sure. And with that, I will turn it back over to our chamber host, Mark. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. That was a great session. And it's funny that not really funny, but you mentioned the tornado warning. I had to look back because I remember being in the room back in 2014. And we had Secretary Johnson and Administrator Fugate. We had you. And I believe the CEO of the Weather Channel was actually at the podium when everyone's phone went off. And we thought it was something that he had cooked up. But fortunately, it wasn't. And there was no real tornado in Washington, just a warning. But it's good to be prepared. And I think that was a good reminder for everybody that day. Up next, we have U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas. Secretary Mayorkas is the first Latino immigrant confirmed to serve as Secretary of DHS. He's also led a distinguished 30-year career as a law enforcement official and a nationally recognized lawyer in the private sector. Over the years, he served as Deputy Secretary of DHS and also Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. During his tenure at DHS, he's led the development and implementation of DACA. He's negotiated cybersecurity and Homeland Security agreements with foreign governments. He's led the department's response to Ebola and Zika, helped build and administer the Blue Campaign, which is a campaign that combats human trafficking. He's also developed an emergency relief program for orphaned youth following the tragic January 2010 earthquake in Haiti. He is not only a great secretary, but he is a tremendous humanitarian. Secretary Mayorkas, it's an honor to have you with us here today.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mark, and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation for having me join you today. Thank you to my colleagues at FEMA and representatives from every level of government, from the private sector to nonprofits and academia for joining us today. Together, we are here to find solutions and strategies to build a more resilient nation. But what does that mean in practice? For us, for the Department of Homeland Security, resilience means ensuring we have no single points of failure in moments of emergency or disaster. It means our operations are geographically distributed, so a single flood or tornado or cyber attack does not limit our ability to continue to meet our mission. And importantly, it means that when disaster strikes anywhere in our country, the American people can count on us to respond quickly and effectively. For your businesses and communities, resilience may take on different meanings surrounding what it takes to withstand the impacts of a disaster and recover rapidly should the worst occur. While it can be difficult to define resilience, it's not so hard to identify its success in action. We see it in communities across the country. To give one example, in 2012, the city of Colorado Springs was threatened by the outbreak of the Waldo Canyon fire. By the time the blaze was out, over 340 homes were destroyed, 45 others were significantly damaged, and 2 citizens lost their lives. Since that time, Colorado Springs has implemented a stringent set of building codes to improve community resilience in the face of future firestorms. Out of that tragedy, they built back stronger than before. They gave life to the promise of resilience. Too often it takes a disaster like that one to truly appreciate the gaps and close them. And our department is here to be your partner, to help our businesses and local communities preserve people's security, protect their livelihoods, and save lives. We saw that partnership play out time and again over the course of the unprecedented crisis of the past year. When COVID-19 struck our communities and shuttered our businesses, we worked hand in hand with different industries to strengthen our national response. We overcame unique obstacles posed by this pandemic. We fortified our supply chains. We deployed teams from FEMA to set up community vaccination centers. And we will continue to support the private sector in its efforts to protect its employees, its customers, and our people. Confronting this challenge together could not be more central to preserving our physical and economic well-being in the 21st century. The same could be said of addressing our climate emergency, a generational task that demands our collective energy, our undivided attention, and our unflinching commitment to resilience across the board. This crisis takes a toll on our jobs, our businesses, our health, and well-being every day. And from the president to our department and across the board, we are not just focused on reactive disaster response and recovery, but on making proactive investments in resilience. Rather than wait for intensifying storms and eroding coastlines to wash away our communities, we are acting now to reduce the harms associated with extreme heat, drought, wildfires, floods, and more. Our department has established key partnerships with the Departments of Defense and Energy and the General Services Administration to leverage our efforts and stand up our current resilience framework, a roadmap that applies common principles across our operations to identify, assess, prioritize, and protect the department's critical infrastructure. We're also aligning our resources to our cause. Through FEMA and the Coast Guard, we have issued requests for public input, seeking out innovative ideas to boost our nation's resilience. With FEMA's leadership, we released a guide for local communities and the private sector on how to build resilience and reduce the health and economic risks connected with climate change. And we are committing record levels of resources to this effort. That's why the president announced $1 billion in grants through FEMA's Pre-Disaster Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities program, or BRIC as it's commonly known. That is double what we provided last year. Simply put, our administration is stepping up to the plate with policies and programs that make a difference, but we can't do it alone. Thankfully, we do not have to, because we have an advantage. We have you, the individuals at this conference, ready to get the job done. Thank you for being our leaders and our partners every single day. Thanks so much.
Good afternoon. My name is Nick Schufro. I'm the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Risk Management Directorate in FEMA, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our Public-Private Partnership Conference panel entitled Climate Change, Stress, Strain, and Shock. Do existing systems and/or approaches need to evolve to meet this challenge? Thank you to the Chamber, Foundation, US Northcom, and our colleagues at FEMA and DHS for sponsoring this event. And thank you to the public, private, and nonprofit thought leaders who will be speaking on how private and public sector organizations could react to climate change. As this is a short panel, we are providing brief introductions and our bios are obviously available online. The panelists include William Sweet, PhD oceanographer at the Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services at NOAA. And Billy is a senior oceanographer with NOAA focused on advancing the science and services associated with sea level rise and flood risk. Francis Bouchard, the non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Francis is a long-time insurance public affair professional who's trying to make a career's worth of mistakes, learnings, and experience to drive impact at the nexus of insurance and climate change. Josh Soslak is a senior advisor with the American Flood Coalition. Josh is a senior advisor to the American Flood Coalition, where he brings experience from both the private and public sectors to the effort to address climate risks and build economically and physically strong communities and the nation. And then finally, I, as I mentioned before, am with FEMA in the Risk Management Directorate within the Federal Insurance and Mitigation Administration. And I work to bring risk identification tools, mitigation strategies, and financial management experience to develop positive outcomes in the areas of risk management, climate change, environmental protection, and economic development. So our topic is, the world is changing. Existing systems are getting strained by extreme weather. Current approaches might not be working. People suffer. Infrastructure systems snap. Existing systems may run into capacity issues. A fundamental question is, do public and/or private sector stakeholders need to evolve or launch current systems, approaches, and tools to adapt to the stresses, strains, and shocks resulting from climate change impacts. 3 really quick definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. A system we are defining is a regularly interacting or interdependent group of items forming a unified whole. An approach is a way of dealing with something, and a tool is a device or implement used to carry out a particular function. A couple of FEMA examples: a system, we work on strong building codes, strongly enforced, which are important for creating disaster resilient communities. An approach is the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities, or BRIC program, just mentioned by the Secretary of DHS and also by Camille Crane yesterday. And that's where we're looking to increase funding for pre-disaster mitigation efforts. And then finally, a tool is the National Risk Index, which is a new tool, an online tool that shows community level risk due to natural hazards. NRI classifies communities most at risk to 18 natural hazards, and we'll hear more about that later on. So with that, I'd like to start off by asking Billy Sweet of NOAA's Center for Operational Products and Services to provide some context on what NOAA is seeing as indicators of climate change. Over to you, Billy.
Great, thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to speak to this crowd. As mentioned, my name is William Sweet, Billy Sweet. I'm here to sort of set the record about how climate's changing through many different indicators that we've been tracking. To start with, the Earth is warming. And we know it's not the sun causing the observed warming over the last half century. CO2 emissions continue to rise. And in fact, they're now above 400 parts per million. And these concentrations have increased by about 33% over the last 70 years. So it's not the sun, it's very likely emissions. The concentration of CO2 in our atmosphere is now higher than it's been more or less in the last 2 to 3 million years ago. Heat waves are becoming more frequent and they're lasting longer in major US cities. Rates have increased from an average of about 2 heat waves per year during the 60s to more than 6 per year during the 2010s. The average heat wave season across 50 major cities is now about 50 days longer than it was in the 1960s. Wildfires have become more prevalent. The extent of area burned by wildfires each year has increased since the 1980s, with 10 years with the largest acreage burn since 2004. And this period coincides with many of the warmest years on record. Future warming will likely increase the potential for very large fires, and they account for the majority of burned areas in the United States. Heavy precipitation is becoming more intense and more frequent across the U.S. While in the U.S., eastern half of the U.S., precipitation fall in the heaviest 1% of events has increased between about 25 and 50% within regions, and by 10 to 30% over the western U.S. since about 1960. And these trends are expected to continue and further intensify with additional warming. Strong storms are expected to continue to become more common. There's evidence that overall hurricane power, the duration and intensity of combined hurricane counts in a season, has been trending upwards over the last 4 decades in response to warming oceans. In terms of future changes, Atlantic and Eastern North Pacific hurricane rainfall intensities are projected to increase, as are the frequency and severity of landfalling atmospheric rivers on the West Coast. In terms of coastal flood risk due to sea level rise itself, what I'm really focused on, not necessarily in response to hurricane storm surges, the annual counts of high tide flooding, which are calibrated to the U.S. coastal infrastructure when minor impacts are likely to occur by our National Weather Service and the emergency managers. Flooding of streets and properties and residences, as well as infiltration of storm and wastewater systems. They're accelerating along 80% of U.S. East and Gulf Coast communities on an annual basis. And in response, communities like Miami and Charleston, Norfolk, New York City, and Boston, to name a few, are beginning to find and fund solutions locally to combat this growing problem. And NOAA provides through its digital coast partners and sea level rise and flood viewer to allow communities to examine exposure using the best LiDAR elevation data available for the region to see what their exposure is now and how it's likely to change. As a whole, to give some perspective, relative sea levels, which include land changes as well as ocean changes, has risen by about a foot across the United States in the last 100 years. Though just in the last 20 years, high tide flooding rates have doubled, growing from about 1 to 2 typical on average in year 2000 to now 4 or so last year, with 3 to 7 expected next year. We're tracking these changes and giving next year outlooks so communities can plan and prepare and budget for the expected cost to respond: people, pumps, mobilization costs. As sea levels rise, flooding is becoming more likely, and until long-term measures are in place, these sort of stopgap Band-Aid responses are going to be necessary. For instance, where I live in Annapolis, high tide flood frequencies in year 2000 on average were about 2 days. Last year we saw 7 days. Next year, somewhere between 7 and 11 days are expected. As a whole, across the United States coastlines, relative sea levels are likely to rise an additional ½ foot, upwards of 1.25 feet in the next 30 years. And these are median values. In response, high tide flooding is likely to grow to 25 to 75 days on average, with many East and Gulf Coast locations having this flood become the new high tide if flood defenses don't change. A flood is only a flood if it actually floods. So NOAA, in coordination with its federal partners, have provided input to the 3rd and 4th national climate assessments about future sea level rise to help manage risk. And we're updating these as we speak for the 5th national climate assessment. We'll take these information to build better, in partnership with stakeholders, useful and use agency products and services to help decision makers confront this changing future with the best models and maps to make smart, informed decisions. So with that, I'll close. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Billy, for painting such a vivid picture of the indications of climate change. Now we're going to ask some questions of each of the panelists, and I will start with Josh. Josh, what are the benefits of bringing the public and private sectors together to address the impacts of climate change while simultaneously growing the economy? What worked in the past and why? And how do we unlock additional funding to address climate change issues? What worked in the past?
Thanks, Nick. And let me also thank Mark and the team at the Chamber Foundation for including me and the American Flood Coalition in this important discussion. It's clear to me by just looking at flood impacts, one of the myriad threats of climate change, we can see the impact on our communities and our economy. In the last 40 years, there have been 34 flooding events in the US where the total damage exceeded $1 billion. The cumulative cost of those events was over $156 billion. And that's just the big ones. It doesn't include the small ones. And as Billy just told us, climate impacts are getting worse. So I hate being the bad news guy. So here's the good news. We have the tools and the resources to address this problem if we all work together. Climate change is a whole of nation problem. So it requires a whole of nation effort to address it, as Caitlin noted earlier. We can protect our infrastructure and our communities by building smarter and better. But to do that, we have to understand and accept that there's a problem and that we can address it. Billy and the NOAA team, along with the other amazing resources in our federal science agencies, are already working with the private sector on risk models and tools, as he mentioned, that help us understand and plan for these events. Federal data and research is driving private innovation and development, and that's a great partnership. So now we have to take that and take action on improving our aging infrastructure that wasn't designed for this level of risk. And to do that, we've got to make investments. Congress is currently debating one of the largest investments in our national infrastructure since we built the interstate highway system in the 50s. And that's a critical part of this effort, but it's not enough. We have to engage private capital into this effort for 3 reasons. The first is that even $2 trillion as initially proposed by President Biden wouldn't have been enough to solve the problems we face today and in the future. So we've got to bring in the private sector. That's just how our economy works. But again, the good news is that the investors are ready. Just this morning, there was a story in my news feed of over $12 billion in funds closed by Brookfield Asset Management and the TPG Rise Climate Funds. That's just a hint of what's to come. So the second reason is that about half of our infrastructure in the US is privately owned. So we can and we must engage the private sector to invest in those assets. This requires an understanding about how these decisions are made, and I'm going to leave it to Francis to talk a little bit about that. So the third thing is, remember, I like to be the good news guy, so I save the best for last. The third thing is that investing in resilient infrastructure and communities grows our domestic economy. It creates high-wage domestic jobs. It spurs the development of technology and other innovative solutions that not only protect our communities, but we can then take that and export it to other nations as well, both to help those countries and to grow our economy. At the Flood Coalition, we just completed a study with Johns Hopkins University where we estimated that by investing just $1 billion in flood infrastructure improvements, we can create 40,000 new jobs across America. Doing this will not only require action by Congress, but also the engagement of tens of trillions of dollars in idle private capital that sits with institutional investors like pension funds and all of our 401k accounts. I wish I could tell you this was as simple as just saying it, but it's actually complicated and it requires us all to work together, public sector and private sector. That's what public-private partnership means. It's like at the Olympics. This is a team event and we've all got to be pulling in the same direction. So thank you, and I'm going to leave the tough part for Francis to talk about. Nick?
Thank you, Josh. Now on to Francis. A couple of quick questions for you. How do you develop win-win situations so that both the public and private sectors benefit? What are specific examples of how the insurance and or other public-private partnerships work together? And are there other systems beyond insurance that other financial institutions should assess in light of the increasing impacts of climate change?
Great, thanks, Nick, and thanks, Josh, for suggesting I've got all the answers. I don't. I'm not sure anybody does. I would fully embrace and endorse the concept, though, that's going to take a radical collaboration, to use Nigel Topping's phrase, between the private and the public sector. And I applaud the Chamber for pulling together a panel like this that tries to highlight that. Nick, I'm going to take your questions in reverse order and talk first about kind of some of the system level changes that need to be made. And one that I would highlight is a renewed focus on capturing externalities. Now, when we talk about externalities, we typically focus on carbon pricing, but that's not necessarily what I want to focus on. There's a large debate on that already. I would focus more on the need for the finance sector and the housing and the construction sector to start to price in the externalities of continuing to build in places where we know are in harm's way. These are not free bites at the apple that we're taking here. And when we create problems for ourselves and grow the economic base that's exposed to climate, we're only creating problems down the line. So I do think that there needs to be a resurgent thinking in the finance sector around how we price in those externalities about growing the risk as we move forward. It's a tough balance. We're talking about tax revenues and growth, and no one wants to be against those. But to pick up Josh's point, it's going to have to be an all-team effort to kind of bring all the stakeholders together and understand and address this. You know, your second question about are there PPPs or versions of them that have worked with the insurance sector? And I'd say, yeah, there's a lot of them. You know, probably the most high-profile one today is a group called the Insurance Development Forum, where it's really a consortium between the World Bank, the UN, development agencies from Germany, Netherlands, England, elsewhere, and they're really and leading insurers and brokers are really focused on utilizing and leveraging the tools that insurance brings to the developing world. And the IDF is getting a lot of traction, and they're starting to move into maybe 20 countries out there. So it works. You know, there are other versions of it as well. There are project-specific PPPs like the Mexican Coral Reef Project that TNC, Swiss Re, and a few others have done. And then I'd say there are a few that we're quite familiar with, but we might not think about it in those terms. You think about the NFIP, you think about the crop insurance program, you think about the Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. These are all public-private risk-sharing mechanisms that have been put in place to deal with a very challenging and difficult exposure. And I do think, you know, if we go into to your first question now, and what are the win-wins, you know, I do think we need to start thinking in those terms, but also to think beyond risk transfer. And why I say that, I go back to your terminology about systems, approaches, and tools. You know, the insurance is an approach, but insurance is delivered through a tool of a 12-month insurance contract. You know, the ability of that contract to incentivize risk behaviors for a risk where it might develop in 5, 10, 15, 20 years is a challenge. So I don't think that it's going to be sufficient to focus on that tool. Similarly, insurance tends to incentivize resilient behavior at an individual property level. And these risks are systemic. So the insurance industry is going to have to think of a different approach to creating and delivering its value. lucky thing is that we've done this before. You know, coming out of the 1890 World's Fair, where this incredible new invention called electricity was kind of unveiled to the world, a bunch of insurance companies got together and said, "This is wonderful, but boy, you know, there's some risk here if we're going to bring, you know, these sparks and these wires into homes and factories around the world." So the insurance industry created something called the Underwriters Laboratory. Similarly, when the highway system was unrolled in the United States, the insurance industry got together in 1959 and created something called the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. Not a road gets onto the car, not a car gets onto a road today in America without going through the IIHS rankings. We all know that. The point is the insurance industry went beyond risk transfer and started to think about risk awareness, risk identification, and risk mitigation. And I'd say that that's where we need to go to create these win-win situations in the climate space as well, Nick.
Thank you, Francis. And then now back to Billy with NOAA's scientific and technical perspectives. Billy, what science and or services associated systems in NOAA is NOAA developing and refining to identify the impacts of and community vulnerabilities resulting from climate change, including addressing the challenge of sea level rise and flood risk? How confident are we in the data? Does uncertainty still play a role in determining our approach? And are our systems robust enough to be able to predict the stress, strains, and shocks arising from climate change?
Well, that's a great question. Well, you know, from a NOAA perspective, I think one of the things that we're most focused on right now is really helping sort of graduate and granulate risk within, you know, the designated flood zones, at least at the coast. So speaking about coastal issues right now, we know that flood risk is not the same in the flood zones. And how's that changing with sea level rise? And how's that characterized? How's that risk change around the country? You know, there's different factors that are affecting risk, whether you're on the West Coast and it's wave driven, it's really erosion, it's bluff collapse, it's a different phenomena. East Coast, it's high rates of sea level rise, as well as the Gulf Coast, it's storm surge. It's a myriad of issues, big, punctuated events and this chronic sea level rise, events, and how does one adapt to accommodate both? Sometimes there's similar approaches, sometimes they're not. Then, the overlay on the maps, where and how do we actually visualize and communicate that risk to folks so they can understand, where they're situated, what their exposure is now, and how's that likely to change. And that's particularly important as communities start to holistically examine, their set of systems, whether it's storm and wastewater, transportation, emergency response. There's sort of a Bayesian approach. Where's the weakest link, and how do you protect this whole system of systems, and especially as we move forward in a changing climate. And then the underserved, the disadvantaged communities that might not really have the assets to really respond in a way. So that's a challenge. So, getting this information out in a way that's very easy to digest and use and incorporated within planning tools, I think is really the first step we're concentrated on here at NOAA, to work and build that capacity so that that review and that undertaking can be comprehensively done with, federally provided science and services and models, so that, everyone is sort of playing on a level playing field and can really utilize the resources they need then to spend to make the adjustments and to mitigate accordingly. So not exactly answering your question, but I think at least in terms of science providers, providing the information to the users, whether it's the or the consumers, the other federal agency families that needs information, like the DoD, the Army Corps of Engineers who need this information, or it's communities alike. It's really trying to be forward-looking, but specific enough at locations that decisions are really made at a local level. So we need to do it everywhere, but we need to make sure it's specific enough so that decision maker at a place on a map can say, I can use this to make a decision.
Thank you, Billy. Okay, so we have about 3 minutes left. And so what I'd like to do in our remaining time is open it up to each of the panelists, having heard your colleagues present, and open it up. If you have additional thoughts, you can either elaborate on what you've spoken about or some additional thoughts. And we'll start off with Francis, please.
Yeah, Nick, I think I'd go back to Billy's astute point about the need to put the tools in place that people can use. I would go a step further though, Billy. It's not just access to the analytics and access to the science. In discussions I have with community activists and community leaders, they oftentimes struggle with the skill sets to actually know how to use those tools. So it's one thing to be given the key to a Ferrari, you actually know how to drive it, right? And I think industries like mine, the insurance sector, need to really think about, we have those skill sets en masse. We hire them and train them thousands at a time. Are there other ways we can bring skills from the private sector and make those available to the individual leaders who are making tough decisions and are being asked to understand the analytics when maybe that's not what they were brought up to do professionally. So Nick, I think there need to be new approaches to skills sharing, perhaps, and really embrace what Josh described rightfully as kind of this all of country, all of nation approach.
Thank you, Francis. Billy?
Agreed. You just can't dump sets of information on folks and expect them to know how to transform this into decisions. And I think that is that capacity building part it's so important that Francis mentioned. We want to make sure that folks can actually use the information we're delivering and customize it in a way, whether it's through boundary organizations or other private entities or partnerships. I'm all for it. And NOAA as well, and that's really what we're trying to do is deliver those sort of climate sciences, both the federal agencies, states, tribes, communities, businesses, especially businesses, to help people, protect lives and livelihoods in this changing world, whether it's baseline trend information, you name it. It needs to be understood. It needs to be digestible. And that's something that we continue to, work towards. And it really takes that partnership, I think, to really empower others that can help, transform, decision making. And, it's a work in progress, but something we're committed to at NOAA, whether it's weather and impacts that are likely to occur tomorrow, or it's changes that are occurring. And we really need to, clear guidance about how to plan and build, to keep our viable footprint, for the next several decades.
Thank you, Billy. Josh, last word.
How about 4 things? Funding is great, but it's not just money. It's business risk and process management as well, as Francis talked about. Permitting and project approval speed and confidence is key. I applaud the administration for understanding and focusing on this, as well as key issues of equity and inclusion. Another thing the federal government can do that doesn't always cost the taxpayers money is de-risking projects with loan guarantees and federal process tools, but they also realize that the private sector has a role to play in this as well. So finally, I just leave you with, it's a team effort, and only as a team, public and private, can we succeed.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you again to our panelists who offered a wide variety of ideas on systems, approaches, and tools. Thank you again. We appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts, and want to thank the Chamber Foundation, Northcom, and our FEMA DHS colleagues in sponsoring this event and inviting us to join today. Have a good rest of afternoon, and thank you all.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on supply chain resilience in the grocery and retail sector. I'm Kathy Fulton, and I'm privileged to be able to moderate this discussion today. With me, I have Doug Baker from the Food Marketing Institute and Jerry O'Dwyer from Deloitte. And we're going to talk about quite a lot of things today related to food and grocery and retail. But before we do, I just want to give the gentlemen just a moment to introduce themselves and their organizations. So Doug, why don't we start with you, just a few seconds on FMI.
Sure. Thank you, Kathy, and thank you to the U.S. Chamber and FEMA for having me participate today. FMI is the Food Industry Association. We're a not-for-profit trade association that represents retailers from single store operators up to large national, multi-state and multinational chains, as well as product manufacturers that produce the food to sell in those stores, and then pretty much any company that wants to do business with or is needed in order to support the industry from end to end.
Terrific. And Jerry, over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jerry O'Dwyer. I'm a partner with Deloitte Consulting. I've been a supply chain professional for the last 25, 26 years, and I focus in grocery and retail.
Great. Well, that is some good perspectives that you guys have to bring to the conversation today. So I'm going to open it up. Ms. Durkovich gave everyone a charge today when she asked her panel about their definition of resilience, and she talked about bouncing forward. I'm actually going to open with the same question to both of you. And Doug, I'm going to start with you again. What is your definition of supply chain resilience?
Hey, Kathy, every time I write it down, I tear it up and start over again. But if we put ourselves as citizens, the consumer, the customer at the center of this, then I guess the best way I can describe it is the ability to respond, recover, or adapt to an internal or external influencing event to ensure that those communities maintain access to caloric, hygiene, and sanitary needs. That's the best I can do, but there's so much more that could go into it.
There is a lot more that could go into it, but I got respond, recover, and adapt. And I think that adaptation is going to come up a lot in our conversation today. Jerry, same question to you. What's your definition of resilience?
So I'll try to be additive to Doug. So I agree exactly with what he said. I think the issue of resilience is how quickly can we recover and how quickly can we adapt so we get back to the assurance of supply or the things that we need to be coming through the supply chain. So there's an element of speed and adaptability and reducing the trough, if you will, in the disruption.
Yeah, if we position ourselves as supply chain experts, that assurance of supply should be top of mind for us at all times. But terrific. So we have, all three of us had opportunity to talk ad nauseum about the challenges and changes that we've seen over the past 18 months due to the pandemic. They've certainly tested the resilience of all industries. Some very egregious examples were highlighted within grocery and retail. But I'd love to hear from each of you, just kind of some specifics, what you think were the challenges and some of the changes you've seen. And Jerry, I'm actually going to start with you on this one.
Well, I think the key challenge when you get past all the shocks to the system, it really is, as we talked the other day, it was a balance of philosophies of having efficiency versus effectiveness, or the management decision or philosophy of just in time versus just in case. And those are trade-offs each of our clients have made and the industries have made in the spirit of having minimizing inventories and maximizing efficiency and earnings. So what I don't think people or clients were ready for was they were ready for supply disruptions. What they weren't ready for was the labor disruption. How do you get the workforce comfortable to be coming back and being on the front lines? Grocery retail, I mean, there's probably no better definition other than healthcare workers who are really on the front lines. So as I see it, the challenge was, how do you unwind quickly and adapt your system to what has always been the razor's edge margin, if you will, of efficiency versus effectiveness. So that's not something, I think the rules of that got thrown out. It's like, we have to respond. And I really don't care what it costs. Our customers need food. They need water. They need supplies. And that playbook sort of got thrown to the side.
Yeah, certainly. You mentioned assurance of supply, and whatever it takes is in order to deliver. You talked about just in time and just in case, and on a call earlier today, a colleague reminded me that we also should be striving for just enough, because we don't want to go too far in either direction with our just in time or just in case strategies. Doug, same question to you. Talk about the pandemic, what you have observed with challenges and changes over the past 18 months.
Yeah, absolutely, Kathy. And a couple of the points to Jerry's point here is, we when we recognized and realized some of those issues, it was really about keeping the machines running and keeping people in the store stocking as much as possible. So, that was like having Christmas holiday sales 7 days a week after week after week. right? That you can't prepare for that. And so a couple of the things that we did was immediately created 2 partnerships, one with Eightfold AI to help facilitate recruitment of labor from sectors that were closed down into the food sector, and then also with the International Food Distributors Association, so that we could start redeploying product and equipment and people in warehouse space over to retail. And that's now known as the Food Industry Exchange, which is still live and well today, and it allows producers and distributors and retailers to connect and share offers and needs across sectors. But the other thing that really sort of was, we didn't understand the dominoes were just going to start falling, was some of the challenges were getting our employees to work. And it didn't matter whether they were in a store, a manufacturing facility, an adjacent sector that supported retail, but it was how do we allow get them through those local ordinances and get them into the places of employment that have been deemed essential. So we had to quickly come up with a letter that several of the retailers and product manufacturers could use on their own company letterhead that would identify them as essential. And then that still took some time, because either the message wasn't getting down to the local level of government, or they were really sort of, sticking to the letter of the law at the time. And so it took a little while to move through that. And then it was the other area that was a real big opportunity that was, I have a great example of, was the lack of visibility into the whole of the grocery supply chain, right? We think about agriculture, we think about ingredient manufacturer, wholesaler, distributor, retail, but we don't think about the adjacent sectors that also supported the industry. And so one great example was the pin pads at the register. Whether it was a consumer or it was the cashier, they were trying to keep them clean and keep them sanitized, but they effectively were putting too much moisture into the pin pad and it was shorting out. Well, the companies that actually manufacture and maintain those pin pads were not identified as essential. So we then participated in an activity to help the White House and federal government understand the whole of our industry and what some of those adjacent sectors are and adjacent businesses are that support the industry, so that we could get them deemed essential and get them back into business.
Doug, you just you hit on things that I think you probably know are really important to me personally, and the value of partnerships. But you identified not just private-public partnerships, but also private-private partnerships. I know from the essential letter that you created, you were also sharing that across industries with, your peer associations. So kudos to you. I think we all should be thinking about what are those opportunities to leverage best practices to take our lessons real time out into the communities.
Yeah, I can't agree more. There was a lot of new relationships, and one of them was with the Restaurant Association, right? We're typically in competition, and they were doing 54 cents of every food dollar being spent. It automatically went back to grocery, and we went from friendly competition to very important in each other's lives.
Yeah, and those partnerships, unfortunately continue, and but so glad that they were made. We talked about partnerships there. I'm curious, do you guys think that the lessons that we've learned and the changes that were made, do you think that they are enabling resiliency, or are some of the technology solutions that we've seen put in place, are they just becoming another point of risk for us? And Jerry, I'll start with you there.
So Kathy, that's a really good question. There's a couple of parts of that. So I'll talk about the partnerships first. So some of our clients have thought of their supplier relationships as vendors, not partners. And I think the pandemic exposed that as a weakness in terms of in a period of short supply, you supply your partners, not someone who's beating you down on to the penny on product. So I think there's more and more conversation, as you said, private to private, around how do we partner better. And then within that, there's a discussion around transparency, and it's something Doug mentioned earlier about visibility through the supply chain. And it goes also to the technology question. So the visibility is, clients across many industries are looking for transparency end to end. And what we've experienced over the last 18 months is many of our clients didn't have that end-to-end visibility. They didn't know that a certain portion of the supply chain was outsourced in another tier or another node. That was exposed. And to your last comment about technology, being in supply chain, I hear all the time now the topic of control tower, which essentially is how do you get end-to-end visibility? And there's technologies that do that. I can tell you before the pandemic, a conversation happened two to four times a year. A client had a specific need around assurance of supply. What happens in a physical breakdown of something, a plant blows up or a fire, and you have to redirect. But now, almost every industry, from actually the aid industry to retail to defense, everyone's talking about control towers, which all it means is end-to-end visibility.
Yeah, that's terrific. Doug, same question over to you. And are we more resilient? I mean, I guess really that's at the core question.
Yeah, I think, Kathy, we're taking steps, right? There's some might say they're baby steps. Somebody might say that they're giant leaps. But I can speak for the grocery industry is, our technology advancement just for e-commerce, as an example, accelerated 5 years, as well as the sales. So the way retailers meet consumer needs has accelerated and really sort of broke the mold. And food retail is typically a little bit slow to change. We saw a lot of the technology advancements in soft lines and apparel and in technology, but not necessarily in food. And the pandemic pushed us there. And the use of automation and robotics and AI is really being accessed and taken advantage of these days. And some of them are quick wins, and some of them are going to be wins that are more experienced a little bit over time. But I do believe that there are things being put into place, whether it's streamlining SKUs and not bringing back those SKUs back because we thought we needed them. We don't really need them. Adding equipment, adding new types of equipment, adding additional forward warehousing. As you mentioned, moving from a just in time to just enough. Where is that? And utilizing AI in order to identify where that is. I do think that we continue to improve and we'll be able to respond, but it doesn't mean that we won't find ourselves with new challenges because each crisis is a little bit different. And so we'll have to continue to learn from them.
So Kathy,
go ahead, Jerry, please.
So what's interesting now is the whole topic of supply chain resiliency is now at the board level. And now we're experiencing, there was resiliency through, shortage of supply and diminished demand, well, for some things, but now we have resiliency issues with respect to recovery. And, and you see that in commodity prices that have fluctuated greatly, whether it's lumber. So now it's a different issue, but the topic of resiliency, how do you handle the downturns? How do you handle the upturn? How do you handle supplier relationships? How do you handle the financial implications of, I know I have to be resilient and that comes at a cost. How do I do that? So it's now a board level issue.
Yeah, I just was sent a study this morning. I've not had an opportunity to read it yet. Actually, Doug, your colleague sent it to me about that very topic, Jerry, getting supply chain is now at the board level attention. And quite honestly, it's at the public's attention as well, right? Whether it's because of toilet paper or whatever, everyone at least knows the buzzwords supply chain now. Whether they understand it or not is a different topic.
Well, even the president put out his executive orders around improving the nation's supply chain capabilities around 4 or 5 different areas.
Yeah, exactly. So we've talked a lot about kind of internal workings. Let's switch now. We are at the private-public partnerships conference. What would you love to see from? You're both private sector folks. What would you love to see from the public sector to help increase resilience? What can government be doing to help private sector? And Jerry, I know you may want to put a nonprofit lens on this as well, but how can we all work together towards building resilience? And Doug, I'm going to start with you this time.
Sure. Yeah, a few things that, and I know Rob and I have had several conversations about them as well, but there needs to be really good coordination from federal, state, and local. And it's on the basic, it's in the waiver system, the ordinance process. So the more that we can streamline that and be efficient with that, that's both the benefit of being a United States, and it's also one of the disadvantages of being a United States.
Yeah.
I would also say too, and this is really any type of crisis, is how can we do a better job pre-planning pre-planning with the food industry for mass feeding? We've talked about that too. Sometimes the current program, it creates too broad of a pool and doesn't have enough assurances that the winning contractor has the supply chain to support those needs. And then the last thing that we really saw, and it can really be proactive too. So it's how do we build business at the same time? It's working more closely with small local farms to gain GAP certification, which allows to increase sources of supply and get more food into the system. So those are just a few things. There's probably several others, but a few that get us started.
Yeah, Doug, I love your recognition of getting more supply into the pipeline, especially as we look at critical situations like the mega drought out west right now, where a good portion of America's food is produced. So, Jerry, same question. What do you want from your government partners to be able to help build resilience?
Well, I think investments in infrastructure, and obviously we're talking about that at the national level and the federal level. But what I mean by that is we need an infrastructure based on technology and some things that Doug talked about, but also prioritization of resilience. And so, for instance, we needed a way to make sure how we keep the flow of goods. How do we keep visibility? And when I deal with emergencies, whether it's in the disaster work I do, information and capabilities are often siloed. And we need to move beyond that to, in pockets. I think within states, we did a really good job of coordinating aid and coordinating response. And I think there needs to be a priority made around not disaster, but like it's just, holding dear those things that sustain this nation: food, water, healthcare, those types of things. That there needs to be a better coordinated response, as Doug said, at the federal, state, and local level, because it's at times it appeared we were all out, at those different levels, you were all out optimizing at each of those nodes as opposed to an overall national response. Investments in technology, investments in infrastructure, investments in port capacity. We have a significant reliance on other countries for our supply chain.
Yeah, there's so much we could delve into there. Unfortunately, we're getting close on time here. So 15 seconds or less, last comments, and Jerry, will go to you first.
As I said, supply chain is a board level issue. Have to invest in to think through what your strategy is, and depends on the sector, but there needs to be several scenarios, and you have to do scenario planning.
Great. Doug.
Yeah, investment in people and technology, because those are the two things that are going to get us through crises.
100% agreed. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and your commentary today. To the Chamber, FEMA, Northcom, DHS, thank you guys for the invitation. And I believe I'm turning it back over to Mr. DeCoursey for the next session.
Thanks, Kathy, Doug, and Jerry for that insightful discussion on supply chain resiliency. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Jen Easterly. She's the director of the DHS's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. As we all know it as CISA. Director Easterly, who was confirmed by the Senate just over 2 weeks ago, has dedicated her career to public service and upholding national security, including 2 tours at the White House with President Obama and also with President Bush. She also serves as Deputy for Counterterrorism at NSA. She's a 2-time recipient of the Bronze Star, and Director Easterly retired from the U.S. Army after more than 20 years of service in intelligence and cyber ops. As director, she leads CISA's efforts to protect and defend civilian and government networks, manage systemic risks to national critical functions, and collaborate with state, local, tribal, and territorial partners and the private sector, all to ensure security and resilience of the nation's cyber and physical infrastructure. Director Easterly, thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark, for the kind introduction. It is an honor to be here today with everybody for the 10th annual Building Resilience Through Public and Private Partnership Conference. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. As Mark mentioned, I was just recently sworn in as CISA's director about 2 weeks ago. So I'm truly excited to be here as this is my first official speaking engagement in this role. Prior to joining CISA, I actually worked in the private sector for 4.5 years, culminating as the head of resilience at Morgan Stanley and the global head of our Fusion Resilience Center. It's interesting as you think about this model, particularly what I just heard at the end of the supply chain discussion. I was actually asked to go to Morgan Stanley to lead and build our Cybersecurity Fusion Center, which we did. But at the end of 2019, there was a recognition that given the hybrid threat environment that we operate in, given the fact that physical and cyber risks are converged in this very digitized world we all live in, that we actually wanted to expand our platform from just a Cybersecurity Fusion Center to a Fusion Resilience Center with a mission to plan for, understand, prepare, respond, recover to any sort of business disrupting event or risk that would affect our critical business processes. So that included cyber or cyber-enabled fraud, terrorist attacks, weather events, geopolitical unrest, or pandemics. So resilience really is something near and dear to my heart. And quite frankly, my view over the last 4 years in working to ensure the resilience and security of our systems at Morgan Stanley is what brings me back into government for this fantastic opportunity. I really enjoyed my time in the private sector, but I am thrilled to be back in government serving my country where, as Mark mentioned, I spent the majority of my career. Securing our homeland and solving the challenges facing our nation is arguably more important now than at any point in our history. And I believe that CISA is positioned to make an impact, and I want to be a part of it. I know that this is the same mission that all of you have, so I want to thank you upfront for everything that you do to protect and secure our nation's critical infrastructure. CISA's mission is to lead the national effort to manage cyber and physical risks to our critical infrastructure. And our vision is one of secure and resilient critical infrastructure for the American people. This mission really connected with me and has drove me to be a part of this team. But the importance of the mission is becoming increasingly apparent as we've seen over the past several months. In today's globally interconnected world, our critical infrastructure, our American way of life, faces a wide array of serious risks with very real consequences. These risks come from Mother Nature, a diverse group of threat actors, including nation states, cyber criminals, terrorist groups, and other nefarious actors seeking to take advantage of our open society and the proliferation of technology to do us harm. We know that today, extreme weather events and other natural hazards seem ever present in the news headlines, all the while the heightened threat from terrorism and violent crime remains. It's increasingly local and often aimed at open gatherings like houses of worship and theaters, stadiums, and schools. And it's not just physical risks we need to worry about. As network devices further weave into our lives and our businesses, these vulnerabilities provide additional attack vectors from nation states and criminals. As the last discussion went, global supply chains introduce the risk of malicious activity in software and hardware. And I can affirm it absolutely is a board level issue from the job that I came from. Aging, outdated, under-resourced infrastructures are also a challenge that we're all familiar with across the country. During any emergency, communication between first responders and between decision makers may be at risk from disruption or a lack of interoperability. The list goes on. But I think that these examples really illustrate the dynamic environment that we all find ourselves in. To combat these threats and to build resilience into our critical national functions, those that keep the water running, the lights on, the gas pumps full, require strong partnerships between public and private sectors, and really what brings us together this week. Now at CISA, we understand that only by collaborating and sharing information across all sectors can we truly build a full understanding of the threats that we face. That's why recognizing the importance of our partnerships, and really more than just partnership, but operational collaboration, is so vital to the success of ensuring the resilience of our nation. CISA is dedicated to defending against urgent threats and hazards, as well as planning and collaborating to strengthen our critical infrastructure for the future. Our belief is that through collaborative risk management, we can prioritize the top urgent risks of today, mitigate them, and drive results against those priorities. For physical hazards, we conduct vulnerability and consequence assessments to help our partners across sectors understand and address risks to critical infrastructure. Just to give you a couple examples of this work, in 2020, CISA conducted 81 cyber and infrastructure security exercises, reaching over 9,000 individuals. 93,000 of our partners also successfully completed our active shooter preparedness training last year. As I mentioned earlier, physical threats can come from Mother Nature, and CISA plays a key role in preparing for and responding to natural disasters. We work closely with our partners at FEMA. We help bring together the right people before, during, and after events to help communities prepare for and rebuild faster. In emergency communications, CISA leads the effort to ensure that national security and emergency responder communications are up and running. Last year, CISA provided emergency communications technical assistance in all 56 states and territories to address capability gaps, implement solutions, and provide training to allow for the seamless flow of information during incident response. And for cybersecurity, we focused on the most significant threat actors. Gaining visibility, taking action against these threat actors requires daily collaboration with our partners in industry, the intelligence community, and of course, law enforcement. Through our partners in the federal civilian enterprise, CISA collects incredibly rich data that allows us to look across the entire ecosystem to spot trends and threats or vulnerabilities, and to share that knowledge that we gain with our partners through products such as alerts and bulletins, toolkits, cyber threat indicators, and other advisory documents. You know, to give you just a few examples of the types of alerts we released, in the past 8 months, CISA has issued 4 emergency directives for federal agencies and activities alerts for network defenders, providing vital information needed to secure and strengthen their systems against critical software vulnerabilities found in systems like the Microsoft Exchange servers, the Pulse Secure Connect products, Windows print spooler services, and certain SolarWinds products. You know, as we look ahead, we know that threats against our digital infrastructure are only going to become more sophisticated and advanced, so we need the private sector to continue to share information with us so that we can use it to protect everyone else. I hope that most of you are already working with us, but I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of doing so. First, we can provide context to what you are seeing as the private sector, given our unique position to capture a holistic view of the threat landscape. We're also uniquely positioned to bring together all of the stakeholders, companies, federal agencies, the intelligence community, law enforcement, our state and local, tribal and territorial partners, and academia to solve some of the toughest critical infrastructure problems, to understand new technical solutions, and also to look at how our adversaries are adopting and utilizing technological developments and what we need to be doing to make ourselves more secure and resilient. And also, in a world where cyber incidents are top of mind every day, we deploy expert teams to help entities mitigate and recover from cyber incidents, and we stand ready to provide support to victims. We are clearly stronger together, so I urge you to continue to please share information on the vulnerabilities and incidents that you're seeing so that we can analyze and share that threat information to protect not just the identity of victims, but protect future targets from compromise. The key to resilience is working together to play the long game. If we're only addressing what's directly in front of us, it will be nearly impossible to be ready for the threats we have not even imagined. Working together to build capacity and invest in capabilities early and often will result, in my view, in a more secure and resilient nation. At the end of the day, CISA was created and built by design to work across the public and private sectors to improve the security of our nation's critical infrastructure. And if the last year has taught us anything, it is that the threat landscape is only going to continue to evolve and become more complex. So whatever the threat of tomorrow is, we must begin preparing today, and we must do it together. Thanks so much for the opportunity to spend time with you today and for working with us to defend today and secure tomorrow. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Director Easterly. We wish you all the success in the world at CISA. Next up, we have another timely conversation. This one is between emergency response leaders to share best practices for information distribution during crisis. As we've seen, when a disaster strikes, time is of the essence for businesses. And during times of crisis, knowing the status and the needs of the businesses is really key to setting response priorities, and having a direct line to government agencies who can also provide relief is so critical. And before we jump to the panel, I just wanted to share a great example of info sharing. I'm joined by Jim Morantz. He is the CEO of Sabre. For those of you who are not familiar with Sabre, Sabre stands for Single Automated Business Exchange for Reporting. It's a free tool that gives local, state, and federal agencies 24/7 access to a business's situational awareness, their data as they disclose it, so they can be prioritized and expedited for relief operations. And as each year seems to bring increased frequency and broadening ranges of different types of disasters, this tool is more important than ever. And this is only one example, but it's an important one. Sabre has over 130,000 businesses on its platform of all sizes and across industries. This enhanced collaboration between the private and public sector can have a huge impact on building back a community after a disaster event, especially for businesses that support lifelines of food, fuel, pharmacy, or retail. And I'm also reminded of former Administrator Fugate's saying that a business is not ever truly recovered until there's a resumption of commerce. Given the foundation's longstanding work in disaster recovery and supporting businesses in their resiliency efforts, we're excited to share that the leadership of the Chamber Foundation and Sabre intend to transition Sabre to the U.S. Chamber Foundation's Corporate Citizenship Center by the end of the year. More news on that soon. On to the panel. This afternoon, we're going to talk more about collaborative information sharing, and we're going to be joined by, Jim and I will be joined by other speakers, including Ben Rober, Preparedness and Protection Branch Chief for the Idaho Office of Emergency Management, and Bridger McGraw, Director of Global Security and Services at Athena Health. So, if we're ready, let's get to some questions. First one to you, Bridger. So, during typical crises, we know the lines of communications inside of different companies. There's usually the same executives, the same teams, but COVID was different. Can you explain to us how inside of Athena you had to broaden your communication circle? Who is included and the types of tactics you use to make it successful?
Sure. Thanks, Mark, and to the Chamber, DHS, FEMA, and Northern Command for hosting this event, as well as all the partners here on the call today. When the pandemic started, first I'd like to congratulate all of us who leveraged the incident command system. And it may be a challenge for private sector entities to think about it inside their own organizations. But when it comes down to it, creating the conditions, assessing the actions you need to take, and recognizing the needs that your organization is faced with, that incident command system became a critical element of our response at Athena Health. So in my time there, we've used it internally to bring together all of the partners inside each of our business units, but mainly looking at the non-traditional ones: human resources, legal and compliance, our business continuity functions, and our communications teams. By bringing them in early and showing them the value of creating a unified team, regardless of the size, scale, and severity of an incident, that really helped us when the pandemic hit. That internal, by building the trust internally through repeated partnerships against smaller activities, by the time I had to bring them very challenging news that our 6,000 employees globally were going to be impacted by this, the trust is already established internally. And the incident command system actually played a very important role in us scaling this to be able to operate internally and share information very rapidly with our executives in the early parts of the pandemic, but also to sustain operations over the last 18 months. So I really commend the partnership to actually look internally at your organizations for how ICS might be of use.
So Bridger, a follow-up question to that is, if ICS is working so well now inside of Athena, how do you export that? And how do you bring in other partners, whether they be in the private sector or state and local government?
Yeah, I really look at information sharing. It's interesting. All of the panelists have sort of across the summit here have talked about information sharing in different ways. We've looked at it from the counterterrorism and the actionable intelligence in that space, along with Bob Klasky talking about strategic risk and how do we share information in that space. This is really about how do you take your trusted partnerships. Each of us on this call today has to recognize that we're trading trust with each other. I leveraged, my time at Homeland Security before I joined Athena Health helped me understand that I was going to need trusted information from HHS and CDC, from other companies of like size, scale, and even the sector from Athena Health, and that those were the types of questions that our executives would be asking. What are our peers doing? What are other technology companies doing? Where is the health sector or across the country? How are they approaching this? And by having those external partnerships and those conduits in place, you need them to actually get your internal partners who might be changing, right? There's a lot of turnover, and you have to be mindful of that. But by being able to trade on the trusted information coming into your organization allowed me to push that information very rapidly to our executives and allow them on a repeated basis to evaluate it for our company. And that's where I think I see, again, the external partnerships, that information allows you to build trust with your internal partners that you can find answers to them rapidly. And likely, actually, you're going to save lives, save money, and hopefully help your sector by sharing how it worked. And that's where sector partnerships with HHS really, bore a lot of fruit for our sector, I think, throughout this pandemic.
Thank you, Bridger, for that perspective. Ben, next question to you. So during a crisis, borders don't really matter to companies, but they sure do to state and local government. Can you talk us through how Idaho dealt with this issue during COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. You brought us a great point that a lot of the feedback that we were getting from the private sector was simply just navigating through the different requirements or restrictions that each jurisdiction has, even within the state, let alone a region or across the nation. And so what we did in Idaho was really trying to leverage the technology that we had available and understanding what the private sector needed to in order to make timely decisions and capturing that in real time so that we could display that through them, utilizing our Esri products and dashboards and getting them the proper logins. But we also then had to understand what it is that the private sector needed to have in order to make those timely decisions. We knew or learned very early on as we were dealing with whether it was early run through the food producers and grocery stores for consumables, that within that first couple hours, businesses need to make decisions that are often very difficult to undo. And so they have to have accurate information right from the get-go. That changed a little bit of our philosophy and the data that we were collecting. How are we sharing it?
Oftentimes, especially early on in a pandemic where information was changing so rapidly, changing our mindset of oftentimes we would want to confirm that that information was accurate, and we didn't always have enough ample time to spend validating information, that we had to give the best information at the given time and relay that out. And we found with providing them that information easily obtained and that they can consume, that we in turn, from a state perspective, we're getting either better questions or better report outs from the private sector that we could then use in turn for some of our operational decisions within the EOC. And we found that partnership to really grow as we built that trust and that communication avenue that really truly we want to now sustain through the remainder of the pandemic and into the future for other incidents.
So Ben, following up on that and how you did it and the timeliness of it, did you establish a certain rhythm or cadence other than just get it out there as soon as you felt it was validated enough?
Yeah, I think that was the traditionally we would have an established cadence within an emergency operations center. You know, we following, you know, Bridger had kind of talked about some of the ICS principles, that you establish that that rhythm of when reports come out. With the pandemic, things were happening so quickly and changing, whether it's, you know, mask ordinances or updates or restrictions that jurisdictions were putting into place. We've really found the need to have real-time reporting and utilizing technology to help us get that data and have that be live, if you will, 24/7, 365, because we couldn't afford to wait until the next day to brief that out. We needed to put that information out as soon as possible.
Yeah, and thank you, Ben, for that. And it kind of brings me to our next question, and this one's over to you, Jim. And everything that Bridger and Ben just talked about really feels heavily manual, all right? Not just for the first time you do it, but for every time you do it. So walk us through a little bit about what Sabre and other technologies like Sabre can actually help expedite the transfer of information and why it's so important.
Sure, and before I do that, just want to express our enthusiasm for joining in with the Chamber Foundation in the coming year to make this even more successful. And a lot of that success is based not just on the technologies themselves, but on the trust and sustainability that the technologies help to provide for the public-private partnership. Now, what our technology does, and our whole reason for being, is to help influence government decisions so that businesses can stay open longer and reopen faster in a disaster. So to do that, we gather the business status and needs from companies in a disaster area, and then share them freely with governments in multiple different formats. So there's really no reason why a government can't take that information, no matter what type of a application it's using. And when this works, businesses keep making money, they keep their employees working, and the community's needs are filled. And on the flip side, government stops spending money to fill gaps by what they might mistakenly think are closed businesses, which sometimes end up with a competition occurring between government and business to provide goods to the community. So from a technical standpoint, it's virtually any way that a company can provide information to us, from a spreadsheet to a mobile app to an automated connection, gets normalized inside of Sabre and then published out freely. And that's where it's better than 30 some states now, and all the FEMA organizations and DOD and quite a few other federal agencies then gather that information and view it in what they're already using. And Sabre doesn't want to be another thing that you have to go look at. It wants to be part. So Sabre's data. and that data goes into whatever application the organization is using.
Thank you, Jim. So it's one of these things where programs like Sabre, platforms like Sabre are only going to work if enough people use them, if enough businesses log on. And there's always a resistance from some people in some sectors that say they're asked to share too much. And this kind of goes back to, ESFs, and it kind of goes back to the EOCs, where oftentimes regulators are sitting there next to emergency managers, or sometimes it's the same person wearing two hats. And companies don't want to disclose too much for fear that they will be taken to task after the fact. So, Ben, I mean, sitting in the state EOC, how do you mitigate that? How do you explain to companies that this is what they need to do, and they're not going to be penalized for being part of the solution in emergency response?
Yeah, I think we've seen multiple examples of that, of some reluctancy to share information for that exact reason, of fear of that regulator then taking that information during a disaster or an emergency situation, and then utilizing that. And I think I go back to that point of what we're really striving for, and it's not just Idaho. I think emergency management across the nation is consistently trying to build that relationship in blue sky. So those everyday events where we can build that trust and build that relationship, so that we have those connections already built. Going back to some of those ICS principles that Bridget was talking about earlier, building those connections ahead of an event and knowing who you're going to be talking to and how things are going to be coordinated. If you can do that before an emergency, you're going to be well ahead in speeding up recovery and even in your response phase, if you can build that trust early on. And so I think that's why we've really tried to focus on, through our consortium with multiple states within our region, working and reaching out to the private sector during the normal times, non-disaster times, so that we can establish that relationship. And there's that familiarity between what they need versus what a state or local government needs, and how we can complement each other's efforts without that fear of their feet being held to the fire by a regulator at after the fact.
And Bridget, to you, I mean, FEMA has 6 sites across the U.S. How do you share this real-time info, not just across your enterprise, but with your partners?
Yeah, I built the Global Security Operations Center for Athena, so I knew that like our partners at FEMA with the National Business Emergency Operations Center, I wanted all the information to be available to decision makers in one place. So inside the company, they had one place to get answers, or at least submit requests for information. I will say it was very hard at the beginning, right? We were all racing around trying to learn as fast as we could from, the state of Washington, and their experience first. And then as the pandemic spread, I think what's interesting from my vantage point is that as I found the report that worked, so once the Massachusetts Emergency Management Center agency set up their reporting, it became easier to request that kind of reporting from other states, because you could show them a report and say, hey, do you guys have something like this? Oh yeah, we have that. And it immediately showed, maybe new folks or whoever the watchstander was, that other states were doing something and providing that to the private sector in a normalized way. And sort of that gets rid of, demystifies that regulator issue. I would also like to just commend the Health and Human Services sector. They held a lot more meetings than maybe our sector partnership really did, and they broke down a number of working groups to work on real deliverables like a return to office guide, but some concrete items early in the pandemic that I think really helped other industries, see that there was going to be a path forward. So even in dark times, I think it's really important for us to find ways to work on the positive outcomes that we're trying to achieve. And that brings the regulators in, makes them part of the solution, and focuses us on getting out of the crisis. And I think that's really paid dividends over the last 18 months, because obviously we're not out of this. And honestly, with 6 different sites and 6 different, levels of transmission of the pandemic of COVID right now and the variant, I think it's still important for us to look at each other and in our sector partnerships and make sure we're all doing all right, and sort of share some of that. And that information sharing itself is a good mental health way to support each other as we get through this.
Couldn't agree more, Bridger. All right, gentlemen, we have less than a minute left. How about 20 to 30 seconds each? Best advice you can give to the audience. Jim.
It costs nothing to join Sabre and Sabre's combination of all the data about simple, open, close, and then more complicated after that. But your simple, open, close information is enormously useful to government. So join Sabre, share that information, and you will get benefits.
Okay, we'll make a commercial out of that later. Ben, to you, last words.
Yeah, I think we've said it a few times now, but reach out to those state EOCs and ask for that information. A lot of times we don't know what we don't know, and establishing that communication, telling us what the private sector needs, or what the information you're looking for to help speed that up. Reach out, talk to us, and establish those connections early and often.
Great. All right, Bridger, you've got the last word.
It's never too late to start. It's never too late to start a new partnership. So if you haven't done this yet and you're looking for a way to start, reach out to any of the people attending this summit, and you will find a huge plethora of new partners to help.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Gentlemen, thank you for your service in protecting our country. We'll turn it back to the program.
We are Guidehouse. We work side by side with our commercial and public sector clients to address their most important challenges by advancing strategic thinking and building trust in society. We are the leading consulting firm serving defense, energy, sustainability and infrastructure, financial services, healthcare, life sciences, national security, along with federal, state, and local government agencies. Guidehouse combines leading expertise to deliver world-class capabilities in management, technology, and risk consulting. The future of consulting lives here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gaurav Menon. I'm a partner with Guidehouse. I have spent a majority of my career, over 20 years, working on resilience and recovery. And I'm really excited. I'm honored, privileged to be here with great leaders from our state and local governments. We have Doug Farnham from the state of Vermont. We have Annette Guzman from Cook County, Illinois, and we have Khalil Rahal from Wayne County, Michigan. I would like the panelists to each introduce yourselves in a few minutes. We'll start with Annette.
Good afternoon, Annette Guzman, the budget director for Cook County. I've been the budget director during the entirety of the pandemic, took this role during that time, so has presented a lot of challenges, but also opportunities in how we as government provide services to our constituents. So excited to be here.
Khalil.
Good afternoon. My name is Clover Hall. I'm an assistant county executive with Wayne County. Wayne County is Michigan's largest county. I manage the budget. I handle economic development, the Department of Public Services, and generally all of our state and federal grants. And just like Annette, really excited to be here. Happy to talk about how we provide the best service, and provide some of the best models that we have learned over the last year and a half through the pandemic.
And Doug.
Good afternoon, Doug Farnham. I'm the Chief Operational Officer for the state of Vermont. Most of my background is in tax and finance, so managing the funds that are coming through our central office and going out to all the different departments and agencies for pandemic recovery and response programs. So really happy to be here today.
Well, thank you all. I'm excited to be here. Obviously, I know for a fact that all three of you are dealing currently with COVID and the recovery and all the efforts that happened there. Khalil, I know you're working with the floods that have hit Michigan recently, and I think this is a timely topic. This COVID-19 actually is unprecedented. It has impacted almost every single human being in this country and across the world, actually. Every state, every city, every local jurisdiction has been impacted by this, and so this is a challenge. Obviously, with that, there has been an outpouring of federal funding, much needed federal funding, which is helping your constituents. So I really wanted to get a few ideas, and Annette, I might start with you. How does your government organize around federal recovery funding, especially given that there are so many different funding sources, whether you're a centralized or a decentralized organization, and what are the primary benefits of the way you have organized your government today?
Well, that's a great question. I think, counties are particularly challenged, I think, with centralization because of the fact that there's so many different elected officials that generally make up our county structures. And so while, we might be centrally structured from a financial standpoint, because there's so many different agencies that are really work to making sure that services are provided, there's a challenge presented that we had to really think through so that we weren't having duplicative benefits and so that we could get the money out quickly where it was needed. So we set up, you guys are our consultants, we actually set up a centralized project management office that really was responsible for thinking through all the different funding sources that were available last year and then this year as well, and really worked to kind of have a process that was more like a grant, where we would look at the various funding sources, determine which ones we were eligible for, which ones we were entitled to, thinking through, how do we make sure that things like procurement were included in the process, and ensuring that all these different agencies were involved in understanding what the different funding sources were. And so through that project management office, everything kind of flowed through. And that was important, not only from the distribution of the funding, but also in how we were going to report to the various grantor agencies, whether it was the Treasury, the state, whoever was providing the funding. And so that centralized office was really responsible for ensuring the most recovery dollars were coming into the county, and that they were being used for kind of the broadest possible uses across the county.
Thank you, Annette. And Doug, I know we've had this discussion before, but what do you think, like a follow-on question to this is, when we talk about the compliance requirements and the reporting requirements and the eligibility criteria, what are you seeing in the state of Vermont and how are you dealing with those?
So what I'm seeing right now is evolving reporting requirements and very fund specific reporting requirements. So we have different reporting requirements, very detailed requirements for the rental assistance program. We have program level reporting for CRF, and then we have program level 1-year plans and detail level for the state fiscal recovery coming up. And we're constantly having to adapt and change what information we're collecting. And I realize it's valuable information. It's important to know your outcomes, but it's also putting a really heavy burden and making these monies be spent less efficiently because we're having to spend a lot of time building systems to respond to that. And so I think that's pretty much what we're seeing right now.
Yeah.
So what is the strategy sorry, Khalil, what is the strategy you're implementing right now, Doug, and then Khalil, to deal with this challenge?
Well, we've had to pull on additional resources. I'd have to say our strategy hasn't been very evolved because we're in a position where if the Treasury says we have to submit certain information, we have to do it. So we're trying to align our state level strategic plans with these performance requirements we're going to see coming from Treasury, so that we're not doing double performance measuring and double recording of data. We're just hitting a critical mass where we have to pick and choose what we're going to be able to measure throughout this pandemic because we're having so many requirements come at us.
And Khalil?
Yeah, I think, what I'm hearing, both Annette and Doug talk about a little bit is a capacity issue, not just, maybe for our counties or our particular governments, but also local municipalities who maybe don't have the experience to deal with these funds, right? So in Wayne County, we have 43 different municipalities, the largest of which is the city of Detroit, and the city of Detroit, gets, federal funds all the time. But there are 42 other communities who have to administer American Rescue Plan dollars now for the first time, ever. And they didn't have the experience that we had going through with the CARES dollars. So, we've been trying through, with all of your great help, right, is set up, weekly calls with all 43 municipalities and the state, and lend our expertise and our resources and the experience that we had last year through the CARES dollars so that those communities, feel safe. We are seeing some communities in the state of Michigan being cautious and maybe even giving some of the dollars back because they don't want to take on that level of responsibility. And what we're telling everybody now is, look, if we work together, if we communicate, and maybe if we leverage our funds together, maybe we can take away some of the reporting and auditing issues that you're so fearful of.
No, I think Khalil, I think that's a great point, and Doug, I know we have discussed this before, but I think what we're seeing in the state and local governments is there's a tendency to go back to doing the programs that already existed and doubling down on those programs, while also looking at equity and how do we actually get the money to those communities, as Khalil mentioned, who don't have the experience but who need the help the most. So can you share your thoughts around how is the state of Vermont dealing with this equity issue and with reaching out to the constituents in the communities that need this funding the most? What are any unique strategies you've employed, especially using public-private partnerships or something, to actually get this money to the sources that have been most impacted by COVID-19?
Yeah, I would agree that equity is a huge concern in this area because the communities that have a lot of experience, have a lot of resources, they have shovel-ready projects. They have things that they know they've wanted for a while, and it's really tempting just to put your money. We have more than enough need in that area of projects that we could probably put all the money into those projects. But then the communities that haven't had the resources to plan, haven't had the resources to even scope out what their needs really are. That's what we're working with right now to try to use some federal metrics, really make sure that we're deploying the money intelligently with that equity lens in mind, and we're not just pushing the money towards shovel-ready projects. I think we're thinking about a couple different strategies on how to do that, so we haven't landed in a firm position, but we want to at least make sure some of that money is held back and can go to those communities that need it the most. A little bit of money can go a long way in a smaller community, and Vermont has a lot of small rural communities that need the assistance that they haven't traditionally been able to afford. And this money is a once in a lifetime opportunity to help, push those communities forward and really bring them up to speed so that they have the same access to broadband, to water and sewer, to fundamental building blocks for development that they're behind the rest of the state on.
No, I think that's great, Doug. No, thank you. And Annette and Khalil, I'm going to ask you a little bit of a follow-on question here. So Annette, I know you're in Cook County and you have an extremely diverse population and you have a lot of union laws around, especially when it comes to the premium pay component. Can you describe a little bit your strategy of the thought process Cook County is using there? And then Khalil, of course, building up on the same topic here, right? That equity, trying to serve the population that needs the help the most, especially in your case where now you have the flooding that is exacerbating an already existing situation. What is your thought process? If you both don't mind sharing a little bit on that.
Sure. So, I'll also talk a little bit about the equity piece too, because that's a really foundational kind of policy for the county. As you know, when we did the CARES Act, we worked with a lot of stakeholders, and in particular our metropolitan group here in the county, to come up with now an award-winning equity formula that was used to distribute funding out to communities throughout the county, so local jurisdictions, other taxing districts, and so forth. That experience has really taught us a lot about, how do you get funding to the right places? Because as Doug mentioned, there are a lot of really sophisticated towns and local jurisdictions in the county that have projects that are ready to go because they've been, thinking about them for a long time, but they also have the ability to go out and get additional funding with their finance departments, whereas other jurisdictions don't. So, we have really worked on this equity formula and how do we identify those things. When it came to things like premium pay, CARES Act was very limited in the scope that would allow us to identify first who was eligible for things like pandemic pay, and then also how we were going to pay it out. And I want to remind everyone that CARES Act was originally only supposed to be used through the end of last year, and so the additional time frame that we've been given allows us to have a little bit more informed process. And it's the same thing with ARPA. The criteria is the eligibility criteria is a lot broader, but still determining as it relates to negotiations with our CBAs and our unions, how we would, how much money we would allocate to that in comparison to everything else that we now have the ability to provide funding for. We had to think about that because at the end of the day, ARPA is really supposed to be for economic recovery in our communities. And we really want to make sure that the bulk of that funding is really going to really drive that recovery so that we see sustained economic growth in the region.
That's excellent. And Khalil?
Yeah, I think when we think about how we use federal resources, we try to put it and aim it towards the problem it's intended to solve, right? I think something that we've learned during the pandemic is that it shed a very strong light on things we already knew, right? That there are health disparities in minority communities, that small businesses don't necessarily have technical advice and the resources they need to survive as well as they did. And so, when we, looked at our the funds that we were receiving, we thought about them in that equity lens, because again, that's the light that was shining so brightly throughout the pandemic. And so, certainly when we received the funds that we received, we did the best that we could to drive the resources in that space. When you looked at the PPP loans, the one thing that became very, very obvious, a large amount of both minority and women-owned businesses did not have access to those funds. We designed our program. I want to say we probably put out over $85 million of small business grants. 100% of our grants went to businesses under 50 employees. About 63% went to minority-owned businesses. About 40% went to women-owned businesses. And so, not that, you never hit the bullseye, right? I mean, as Annette mentioned, there was a timeline in which we had to spend these funds. And for the longest time, we all believed if we didn't spend them, we would have to get them back. And so we did the best that we could to get it on the board, if you will. And I think we did a really good job of that, but always keeping that equity lens in mind. And the same thing with the health disparities. And so if there were testing sites that we had to set up, we tried to aim it towards low-income areas. If there are vaccination sites that we try to set up, we try to make it a mobile vaccination site so that we can get to areas that traditionally don't have access to health care for all kinds of reasons.
It looks like I lost volume. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
I cannot hear any of you. So I'm going to go blind here in the spirit of just continuing this conversation. So thank you, Khalil. I'm going to follow up that question, even not knowing the rest of your answer, is you talked a little bit about the PPP loans and you seeing the gap. And I know you employed a strategy of trying to get the private sector to come and help you in dealing with that. Can you describe a little bit? And I know each and every one of you, and I know Doug, you have done this as well. So Khalil, if you don't mind starting with kind of describing what is the strategy you used to get the private sector involved in helping the recovery and easing the capacity constraints. And then Doug, if you don't mind adding on that as well.
Yeah. So we did the best that we can to leverage our relationship with the private sector. When the pandemic first hit and the SBA loans were announced, we noticed that the federal government was moving very slow and businesses needed the money right away. We put up some money with a local bank, the bank, and now it's Huntington Bank, and they're the largest bank in our area, to provide microloans where they administer the loans, but we back the loans with our own money. And what we learned very, very quickly was the pandemic was happening much longer, and there was a need for grants. And we were able to design a lot of our programming with the private sector for the businesses that were truly in need, based on all the information that we got from the loan program and other things. And then we also learned that, you know what, when we needed to provide relief, for pandemic pay or premium pay for people that were out of work, banking was a big issue. And so we worked with the private sector to get $500 debit cards because, for those who don't have a bank, it was easy for us to be able to do that. So, using the private sector, leaning on their expertise, getting them more involved, I can tell you that when you do that early on in the very beginning, they're almost always happy to provide you that free resource, which is a little bit of a capacity issue.
Yeah, and then I would build on that. We had microloans were certainly part of our overall strategy, and we found those to be very successful when you're not trying to control those funds yourself at the state. You're working with a partner who has expertise in that area and can navigate with those and helping those businesses. One of my favorite programs from the pandemic is Everyone Eats. It's basically a food assistance program. And we worked with the restaurants because our hospitality sector is a big part of our economy in Vermont. A lot of people are employed in that sector, and they were all locked down. And the program allowed restaurants to work with the state to keep their staff going, get their staff paid for cooking these meals, and then providing that food. So it met multiple needs all at the same time, and it required coordination through all of our counties and local hubs and hundreds of restaurants participating in cooking these meals. So it was also nice because people weren't just getting what you think of as emergency response food. They were getting quality restaurant food. So I think that program for me was a win-win in a way that we at least helped people get through the pandemic a little bit. It helped cheer people up as well. So definitely people needed it.
So I'm guessing you guys can still hear me, and thank you, Doug, for that. Can somebody say something? I tried dialing in to see if this works.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Awesome, excellent, great. With about less than a minute and a half left for us to go on this panel, I'd like to end with one question to all three of you that I hope you can answer to the best of your ability. But the federal government has done an immense and an amazing job in trying to get this funding out. There are about hundreds of different programs that have been budgeted and provided to state and local governments to work on their recovery efforts. Looking down 10 years down the road from now, where do you think we need to be with federal funding mechanisms to better recover from disasters? So Annette, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think one of the things that Doug said earlier is kind of paramount when it comes to getting funding out to the people that need it. And it's recognizing how local governments budget and how their programs are structured, because when there's so much that's focused on reporting and doing things in the way that the federal government needs it to be for their budget, it really takes away from us being able to get the work done and get the work out and get the money out. So I would hope that we have a little bit better collaboration on how the funding is structured so that the funding can get out a lot quicker.
And with a few seconds left, Doug or Khalil, want to jump in?
Go for it.
I would just say we need to understand our unmet need in the equity area much better. And I think this has shown a light for everyone, that if we have a better idea where unmet needs are, we can react and build on that and kind of close down some of those weaknesses and those deficiencies ahead of time, so it doesn't hurt so bad when something happens.
Gaurav, I'll just end very quickly by saying it's probably it's probably good if we could start designing programs for preventative measures than recovery.
Right. Absolutely. And panelists, thank you so much. Despite the technical snafu and me not able to hear at least 5 to 7 minutes of the conversation, it was a pleasure to have you on. Thank you for carrying the conversation. And I agree. I think we can all, do things differently. We can start being more proactive, the country as a whole, to make sure that our recovery and resilience is stronger going forward. Again, thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Nikki Clifton, President of Social Impact at UPS, and she's also the President of the UPS Foundation. In this role, she oversees the company's efforts to respond to the world's most pressing social, humanitarian, and environmental needs. For years, UPS has placed social impact at the heart of much of what they do, from minimizing their environmental footprint to creating a safe and inclusive workplace for its employees, to empowering resilient, equitable, and safe communities. UPS certainly raises the bar when it comes to corporate responsibility. We're happy to have you here on the virtual stage, Nikki, as the new president of the foundation and head of social impact for UPS. We know you're busy, but we want to talk to you just a little bit about the role. And we know that although it's a new role for you, you're not new to the company. Can you explain to the audience a little bit about your background and how you became president of the UPS Foundation?
Sure. Hi, Mark. It's so nice to see you. Thanks for having us today. And we're so thrilled to be partners with the Chamber on many levels and the Chamber Foundation as well. I was honored to accept this role in November of 2020 in the midst of the global pandemic and the race pandemic. And I've spent the last 8 months really drawing on so many of the skills and leadership opportunities that I've had at UPS. That I've developed really over the course of my 17-year career. Believe it or not, I didn't anticipate leading the foundation during this time. I was in government affairs working with your counterparts on a lot of different labor and employment related issues. And it's really been an inspiring and fulfilling responsibility to be at the helm of the foundation with my wonderful, fabulous team. We really wake up every day asking ourselves how we can make the world better and how we can improve the lives of those in our communities. And so in terms of my background, I joined UPS as a labor and employment lawyer, and I worked out of our headquarters in Atlanta. And I later moved to DC to work on government affairs issues, largely in the workforce and employment space. And so I think that my legal background has really been helpful in preparing me in this role to ask relevant questions and then to carefully listen to the answers. I think with everything that's going on right now, people really want to be heard. And as a labor and employment lawyer, our work is largely about people, really trying to understand what drives people. And I think that's really helped me to be able to be empathetic and to think through how we can best position our skills as a logistics company to really meet the most pressing needs of people. I think in terms of government affairs, the work that I did in public policy has really helped me understand the importance of your narrative and the importance of communicating your why. We did that a lot on the Hill. As you know, your strategy is only good as your communications plan. And so I think that legal background coupled with the government affairs piece and helping me build relationships has been really, really helpful in this role.
Nikki, they say timing is everything, and you accepted the position just a few months after the global pandemic was declared. Can you share a little bit about what you've learned since and how those lessons have really shaped the key priorities of the UPS Foundation moving forward?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit. You know, you're right, timing is everything. And your whole session today is about being prepared and being resilient, right? And in the session before, the team was talking a lot about equity. And what we've learned in this role, in my short tenure in this role, and looking at our strategic refresh, is that 2020, really showed us that businesses, schools, and families really did experience great loss and suffering throughout the pandemic, but it didn't affect all of us equally. And I think it's really important that societies and corporations are finally talking about systemic change, talking about the systems change that we need to really dig into to make nationwide and worldwide impact that's going to be long lasting. And so that's one of the reasons that the UPS Foundation is going to be focusing and centering our work on equity and justice. And I was happy to hear those themes throughout the panel today, the panels that you've had today, because it really is about looking at root cause and looking at what is most needed for the underserved and marginalized communities, and how can we help those marginalized communities really participate in the economy, whether it's women exporting their products, whether it's underrepresented minorities participating more in the workforce and becoming entrepreneurs. That's where we really want to be helpful, and that's our sweet spot. And so we've carved out really 4 areas that we're going to focus on. And we frame this around the moniker HELP. It's health and humanitarian relief, equity and economic empowerment, local community engagement, which is really our UPSers and our volunteer hours, and then planet protection, which is our environmental sustainability and our global footprint. And so we're looking and centering our work through that lens of equity and justice, because we've learned that's what's going to help create a world that we all want to live and participate in.
So Nikki, I've heard this phrase and I've seen it on your website. UPS is moving the world forward by delivering what matters. Given our new normal because of the COVID pandemic, what does that mean?
Oh my gosh. Okay. So that we have a new CEO, Carol Tomei, who recently celebrated a year with UPS, and she has just energized our company and energized our strategy in such amazing and inspiring ways. And so this was one of the first things that Carol and my boss, Laura Lane, created in the corporate affairs group, which is this new purpose statement. And moving our world forward by delivering what matters really it's the clarion call to the why of what we do at UPS. So we've been really focused on understanding what's most relevant. And in the heart of the pandemic, what was most relevant was us being the safety net when there was no safety net. When people couldn't go outside and couldn't get their products, we brought those products to their homes. And that's what mattered. Our drivers and our service providers have not shut down really a single day throughout the pandemic. And I would be remiss if I didn't give just a huge debt of gratitude to them for the work that they've been doing throughout the pandemic. Moving our world forward by delivering what matters means listening to our customers. It also means listening to our communities and really understanding how best we can help people right where they are. So I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, we worked with the Department of Agriculture and McLean Foods to deliver 27 million meals to students and to the elderly because that's what they needed the most at the time. We worked with a lot of different companies to help them rethink what they were doing and how they delivered so that they could move PPE to where it was most needed at that time. So for us, what matters is what's most important to the communities and to our customers.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the partnerships, Nikki, because whether it's with the Department of Ag or with other companies or even the Chamber Foundation and our Resilience in the Box initiative that we launched with UPS several years ago, no one organization can do it alone. And UPS has been just such a tremendous partner and willing to partner with us and others to really make great social impact. And I would be remiss not to say thank you to all the UPS drivers as well. It's not a day that goes by that I don't see one of them or even some of your competitors driving up and down my street, delivering things to our neighborhood. So it was really critical for all of us here to have them on the front line.
They are amazing, and we cannot do this. I mean, we can't give back to the communities without their work. And I say a lot of times that UPS is synonymous with communities, and you could just see that by the way the community has embraced a lot of our drivers and our service providers. It's amazing.
Absolutely. Let's get with a little more specific about COVID. When COVID started spreading first in China and then around the world, what are some of the things that UPS did specifically to jump in and help? And who did you do it with?
Sure. Well, you talked about partnerships, and our partnerships are broad and they are deep, and we count the Chamber amongst one of our most valuable partners. When the COVID-19 crisis hit, we really started looking at how we could respond immediately by designating our employees as essential workers, and we had to work with the government, both state and local, to do that. We were first responders in Asia, and then when the virus started to spread quickly, we immediately acted by getting involved with the US government from the onset, working with FEMA, working with USAID, and also our healthcare distributors. We've got a division of our company, UPS Healthcare, that I just think in terms of being prepared, you talk about preparedness. Wes Wheeler, who is the president of UPS Healthcare, had really been thinking about preparedness with respect to the health space long before we were in the midst of the pandemic. And so he had started looking at how we manufacture cold chain storage freezer farms, and how we look at making sure that we were prepared, not necessarily thinking about the global pandemic, but thinking about health, period, healthcare, period. And so I think that preparedness really put us in a good position to respond. Working with the federal government, we've mobilized more than 250 flights carrying personal protective equipment around the globe. Our healthcare division also opened up a 450,000 square foot distribution center. And that's where we are housing a lot of the vaccines and able to really mobilize those vaccines very quickly out of our air hub in Louisville, Kentucky. As you know, we also partnered with the Chamber to help respond to the crisis in India. So beyond vaccines, we've also been looking at the other related components, like the oxygen concentrators that we moved around the globe to make sure that our friends in India were safe. I'm also really proud, Mark, of the work that the foundation is doing with regard to equitable vaccine distribution. This again goes to the heart of our mission, right? We're of course moving vaccines on the commercial side, but on the foundation side, we're looking at how we can produce in-kind gifts to countries that are the most underserved. And so we've been first in Africa, first in Ghana specifically, with the COVID-19 vaccine. And we most recently delivered one of our largest gifts in kind to date to Indonesia. We're on pace to deliver more than 20 million vaccines from a philanthropic standpoint through our network. And so we're really, really proud of that.
And we're really proud of being part of that too, Nikki. What for the audience, what Nikki alluded to in India is we were moving Medtronic ventilators, as I alluded to at the beginning of the conference, over to India, and we needed transport. And we picked up the phone and called UPS, and they responded immediately, and they helped us out. And we couldn't have done any of that without Nikki and her team, and just UPS as a company is being so committed to helping when help is needed the most. So Nikki, it's not just vaccines and ventilators that you've distributed. I mean, you're also experimenting with new technologies on distribution and delivery. We've got a few minutes left. Do you want to talk about that before we wrap up?
Sure. I always talk to my team, but before, I had the privilege of leading this team. We were led by my predecessor, who also had a great team working for him. And I've got to give a shout out to Joe Ruiz and his health and humanitarian relief team that really incubated a lot of exciting strategies from an innovation standpoint and used those strategies for healthcare distribution. And a great example of that is our drone network. We actually incubated distribution of blood and of vaccines before COVID-19, working with Zipline and with Gavi. And that drone network has really played an important role in disrupting how humanitarian health aid is being provided, especially in remote parts of the world. And so we're really seeing exciting synergies that we've been able to then create broader strategies for during COVID-19. And it's, it's just fantastic. Like in 2019, we were able to reach about 30,000 people in businesses and communities through our vaccine shipments. That's pre-COVID. And now we're working with COVAX and with UNICEF and Gavi to help overlay that same strategy from the technology standpoint to help when the world needs it the most. And so again, it goes back to preparedness, right? Not being afraid to take risk, to thinking about what the world needs the most, and then figuring out what your special secret sauce is. In our case, it's logistics, to be able to meet those pressing needs of society.
Well, Nikki, it's clear to me that you've got a good handle on all of this, and we're so fortunate that you do. Others want more advice, right? What advice would you give these leaders and corporations as they look to build and strengthen their private-public partnerships?
That's a great question. And I think, first of all, it goes back to making sure that you build relationships early. That's one of the most valuable things I learned when I was in government affairs. I did a lot of work, in the legal department where we were working with other lawyers. But when you have to work across networks, whether it's public-private partnerships, with the government, with NGOs, it's important to build those relationships before you need something. My former boss used to say, relationships determine results. And I share that with my team all the time, because you need to be able to pick up the phone and be able to get to folks quickly and sort things out. And, I think about what we're struggling with right now in terms of how to reach the most needed. And Mark, I'll give you an example of what we're doing in thinking about Haiti. We know that the situation in Haiti is very perilous, but we want to help the people that are there. And so those partnerships that we're able to build through some of our NGO partners and some of our government partners is really important to be able to read and have early intel about how we can be most helpful. I think the other piece of advice that I can give is focus on what you do best. In a lot of ways, people want to boil the ocean, and I tend to be like that because I get excited and you're passionate and you want to help everybody and you want to help and do everything all at once. And I think that where we can be most strategic is by focusing on where we bring the best value, and then sharing our skill set with others and helping ask folks what do they need, and really listening to what they need and trying to deliver that in the way that's most unique, using your own special skills. And so I think those are the three things that I would really call out as what I've learned over the last 8 months.
Well, Nikki, thank you for all of that. Are there any parting words that you want to leave our audience? You're our last speaker for this conference.
Oh my goodness. Well, I hope you're still out there, everybody. What I want to say in terms of parting words is, first of all, thank you to the Chamber. Thank you, Mark, for highlighting the work of all the partners that you focused on today. This is not easy work. A lot of times with foundations, people think you're just giving away money. And at the end of the day, our work is very strategic. We want to be impactful. And so when I think about our mission to build more resilient, safe, and just communities, that's what we want to leave our partners with. That is our mission. That's our focus, rooted in equity and justice. And so I just want to thank you and the folks at the Chamber for giving us a platform to talk about our work going forward. And we're proud to be partners with you.
Well, thank you, Nikki. We are proud to be partners with you too. And Chamber has many discussions like this, conferences and roundtables throughout the year. Hopefully soon we'll be back in person, but we would love to have you again so we can dig deeper into these and you can tell and share more examples of how UPS truly is changing the world for the better.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Thank you. Well, thanks to all our speakers for sharing their insights during this such critical time. And I hope you, the audience, will leave here today both inspired and excited about the future that we can shape together. A future that's resilient, a future that's secure, and one that's inclusive. It's within reach. And thanks for making the choice to be here with us these last few days to get moving in the right direction. Before we close, I do want to share with you that we'll be sending each of you a survey to fill out, and this helps us make our programming even better next year. So please fill that out and send it back. Now, what I would like to do is turn it over to our partner, Rob Glenn. And before I do that, I just want to make sure that for those of you at DHS and Northcom and FEMA who've helped plan this event, for those of you at the Chamber Foundation, on our AV team, on our programs team, our Chamber colleagues who joined us, thank you. None of this could be done without you. And we look forward to building a stronger and more resilient future with all of you in the audience. That's it for me. You'll get the last word from our great partner, Rob Glenn. He's the Director of Office of Business, Industry, and Infrastructure Integration at FEMA. Rob, over to you to close us up.
But hey, thanks a lot, Mark, and to the U.S. Chamber Foundation support team for a solid end to this conference and a decade of building resilience through private-public partnership conferences. Throughout this conference, we heard inspiring stories of industry and government rising to the challenge for COVID-19 and other threats, while also being more inclusive and mindful of the dynamic nature of our communities addressing these complex incidents. Indeed, not waiting to do the right thing. We also heard about tangible actions that need to start somewhere: investing, planning, sharing, transforming, connecting, building. There's no shortage of challenge, and there's also no shortage of opportunity. While the official conference does end today, and thanks so much for all the leaders who did take the time to participate, the threats, hazards, and risks are not going away. So some of the opportunities that we have post-conference include tomorrow, and then also Friday, some additional post-conference programming. First, the Defense Production Act may be one of the most talked about, but potentially least understood tools for harnessing the capability and capacity of American industry. We have a post-conference discussion building on the interest of the private sector to better understand what the different authorities are, what the titles mean, and how they can be used. We will have FEMA, DoD, the Department of Commerce, and HHS program offices for the Defense Production Act ready to discuss the history, implementation, and options for the future. Second, and this has been mentioned a few different times in the conference, the Building Private-Public Partnerships Guide was just released last week. Tomorrow we'll have an information session and a webinar, particularly for non-federal government partners, and how to get started. This guide provides recommendations and best practices on how to start building effective private-public partnerships. Lastly, every few years, there is a national level exercise. The next national level exercise is in next year, 2022. You may have heard this before, but it's always earthquake season. On Friday, we will hold an orientation for industry and non-governmental partners featuring a discussion with the states at the epicenter for a Cascadia subduction zone seismic event. You'll see the registration links in the chat. On behalf of FEMA and our partners at the U.S. Chamber Foundation, thank you just not for attending this conference, but taking actions to bring the aspirations of the conference into reality each day. Decide today on the first step to building trust and forging your next partnership. Thanks very much, and we'll see you the next time.